Hello everybody and welcome to Drydock episode 105. This is the Patreon Drydock for the end of July, so strap in because once again it's going to be a slightly longer than normal one. Manani Wanderer asks, who, in your opinion, were the most grossly incompetent captains or admirals in each era? Well, when you go back into ancient history, it can at times be rather difficult to pick a truly incompetent admiral, because although there were many admirals who were pretty bad and a number who led their fleets to some fairly stunning defeats and losses, at the same time it's a very divorced nature of naval warfare as compared to stuff that's a bit more easily quantifiable by today's historians. For example, you could point to the various Roman admirals in the Punic Wars with Carthage who led hundreds of Roman ships to watery graves very quickly after they were built because they had genuinely no idea how to run a navy. But at the end of the day, Rome won that particular war, so well, I suppose there is such a thing as succeeding in spite of yourself, but there you go. From sort of the Middle Ages forward, I would say there's probably 5 top picks. In roughly chronological order, Admiral Won Guan, I think that's how it's pronounced, who was in charge of the Korean Navy temporarily, whilst various court politics had bypassed and sidelined Admiral Yi. I pick him because Admiral Yi had shown through a series of battles, and to be fair, a considerable degree of tactical genius, as well as strategic knowledge, exactly how to husband the relatively small number of Korean warships and inflict a series of devastating defeats on the Japanese. Admiral Guan decided that all of this was entirely beneath him and took the fleet that Admiral Yi had very carefully mustered, preserved and trained, and then did pretty much everything that Admiral Yi had kind of marked down on his big never do this list. Basically sailing his ships out into a direct ambush in the open ocean where, shockingly enough, the superior numbers of the Japanese ships cut his fleet to bits. And then left Admiral Yi, who was very hastily recalled, to try and put everything back together from scratch again. Then I would pick Admiral Villeneuve of the French Navy, and that's not just because of Trafalgar, although Trafalgar is a large part of it. He was also, as was mentioned in the Nelson Part 2 video, present at the Battle of the Nile, and watched the vanguard and middle elements of the fleet getting cut apart, did nothing, and then ran away. And then in the lead up to the Battle of Trafalgar, he knew his ships weren't a match for Nelson's, and yet he took them out into a hopeless battle anyway, and the only reason he did that was because he didn't want to lose face because Napoleon was sending his replacement. Now, it takes an especially incompetent officer to knowingly ride to defeat purely for the sake of personal pride. Then I'd have to say Admiral Persano of the Italian Navy at the Battle of Lissa. The Battle of Lissa video kind of explains why, but when you fail to adequately give your orders, you're hated by half of your fleet to the point that they won't really come to help you anyway, and then you skedaddle off to a completely different ship without telling anybody, and watch your fleet fall apart under an assault that theoretically they should have been fairly easily able to crush, then run home and try and claim it definitely wasn't your fault and you'd actually won. Well, there's a reason that he suffered quite a number of consequences as a result of that particular little debacle. Then, as the picture that's been displayed on your screens for the past couple of minutes may give some clue, I'm going to put in Admiral David Beatty. Indeed, hilariously enough, if you go into Google and type incompetent admiral, Admiral Beatty's entry is the first result. And that's not without cause. As I've outlined in numerous other videos and am explaining in a little bit more detail in the Jutland series, Admiral Beatty had 2 jobs: to find the enemy fleet and report its location, and to keep the majority at least of his ships alive, with a tertiary objective potentially of actually winning an engagement where you had superior numbers. And guess what? He managed to fail all of those. When you're in command of effectively the world's biggest and most powerful scouting force, maybe try scouting once in a while. And finally, again, no real surprise for those who have been watching this channel for any extended period of time, the other one I would put in the World War II period would be Admiral Jean Soult, for deciding he wasn't going to act within the spirit of his orders, and instead deciding that he was going to claim he was acting within the letter of his orders, and then failing to do even that, and ending up getting a bunch of his people killed unnecessarily. So yeah, those would be my top 5 picks for incompetent admirals. Effectively, it comes down to, with pretty much all of them, you had a choice, you had very good reasons and motivations and information at hand to inform that choice, and you proceeded to set all of that on fire and choose the worst possible choice that you could potentially imagine, short of outright turning your ships over to the enemy without firing a shot, largely because you thought you were smarter than everybody else when you really, really were not. Texas and LaShock asks, what were the biggest contributions of the US Coast Guard in the 2 World Wars, and what would you consider their finest hour for each? So in both World Wars, the biggest contribution of the US Coast Guard to the war effort would have to be their assistance with convoy escort duties. Those were the largest and most numerous duties that the US Coast Guard undertook in both conflicts, although it was considerably more so in World War II than World War I, in part because the US was involved in World War II for considerably longer than it was involved in World War I, but also because the US Coast Guard by the time of World War II was considerably better established and had a better idea of what it was doing, as opposed to in World War I, when it was still at that point a service that was only a couple of years old and was still sorting itself out. Now, as regards individual finest hours for each war, I would probably say for World War I, you're looking at the Halifax explosion. And for those of you unaware, that's basically, as it sounds, a massive explosion in the Canadian port of Halifax when a freighter full of ammunition caught fire and went boom, causing quite a bit of damage, and indeed would remain the world's largest non-nuclear explosion for quite a considerable portion of time. And caught in the middle of all of this was one poor single lone US Coast Guard cutter, and understandably not entirely built to withstand the effects of a near 3 kiloton explosion at relatively close range. Nevertheless, the crew decided to almost immediately get themselves to shore and get relief parties off to help the various citizens and other vessels in Halifax Harbour that had obviously also been badly affected by the explosion. And despite the fact that there were British cruisers and armoured merchant cruisers in the harbour, as well as an American cruiser and our merchant cruiser nearby, who also came to render assistance, obviously, the little US Coast Guard cutter was actually picked out in a number of reports for the excellent nature of its relief work, so that definitely stands out as a finest hour for World War I. And for World War II, my personal pick would be Rescue Flotilla 1, as pictured here. Now, as well as convoy escort in World War II, US Coast Guard personnel served quite considerably aboard landing craft in various guises, sometimes partly, sometimes fully crewing them, which is obviously something of a hazardous occupation, considering you're driving what effectively amounts to a large, square, metal biscuit tin straight at enemy coastal defences. But Rescue Flotilla 1 had a slightly more dangerous job, if you can believe it, because at least on the landing craft you had direct fire support, a few weapons of your own, and, well, you're made of metal, which might resist rifle fire and the odd light machine gun round. Rescue Flotilla 1, on the other hand, had a bunch of wooden-hulled cutters, and due to wartime scarcity, after the first few cutters were produced, they also just had plywood rather than bronze wheelhouses, so you have basically zero protection. And their job was not just to be in the vicinity of the D-Day beaches, their job was specifically to go after damaged and sinking or sunk landing craft and other such vessels to rescue the crew. Now, not only is the lack of any kind of armour, or indeed, as you can see, really any kind of forward firing weapons of any particular use rather notable, but also, of course, by the simple fact that you are heading for a sunken or sinking vessel. You are heading for an area where the enemy has demonstrated they actually do have accurate enough and heavy enough weaponry to sink a vessel, and a vessel that's a lot more durable than yours. And yet you willingly drive straight into that area, stop, and start hauling aboard survivors, and, well, hope that the enemy doesn't sink you as well. So that requires quite the considerable level of bravery, and the various lives that they saved, both on D-Day and in other operations, definitely mark that out, I think at least, as one of the finest hours of the US Coast Guard in World War II. Matt Blom asks, how were the German U-boat pens in France engineered? i.e. how did the Germans determine the required thickness of concrete to resist bombing, and what was the maximum sized bomb they were designed to be resistant to? So the basic specification for the U-boat pens varied from pen to pen and was occasionally upgraded either whilst they were under construction or shortly thereafter as the apparent firepower of Allied bombers increased. But the basic idea behind it all was actually a relatively sound engineering proposition, which was take the biggest, nastiest, most heavily armour-piercing bomb that you have, which in the Germans' case would have been something like the PC 1600, which had a notional penetration of about 8 to 9 feet of concrete, and then assume that your enemy will drop something even bigger and nastier. So, for example, one of the pens was designed with a 16-foot thick roof, which was, according to calculations, supposed to be able to resist a bomb weight of up to 7,000 pounds. Now, bearing in mind that something like a big bomb like the PC 1600 was a 1600 kilogram or 3,500 pound weapon, you're effectively designing them to be twice as strong as in theory they need to be. But from an engineering perspective, that makes perfect sense. Now, as I said, as Allied bombs became apparently more and more destructive, and also you had to take into account the cumulative effect of multiple bomb impacts, because if you look at some of those U-boat pens, after air raids they look a little bit like moonscapes, the thickness went up and up. The Germans also weren't just doing pure mass slab concrete, they were doing multiple layers of material to both deflect, break up the bombs themselves, and also then to deflect, break up, and reduce the effect of the explosions that might otherwise result. So there were obviously big concrete slabs in there, but there were layers of granite, there were layers of steel, there were layers of rebarred concrete, there were separate individual layers of slab concrete, and so on and so forth. So there was actually quite a lot of complex engineering that went into it all, but they were even towards the end of the war trying to come up with specs that would resist something like a tall boy or a Grand Slam after it was shown that those particular weapons were more than capable of punching holes into the U-boat pens, because, well, let's be fair, they were absolutely huge, fast-moving weapons, especially in the case of the tall boy, and you can't really fault the German engineers for not foreseeing that particular problem. So, yeah. In terms of maximum size bomb they were designed to be resistant to, initial specs were, as we said, something along the lines of a 6,000 to 7,000 pound bomb, but towards the end of the war there were some under design that, at least on paper, should have been able to resist a tall boy impact or two, which is of course a 12,000 pound bomb. Whether or not any of them would ever stand up to something like a Grand Slam remains unknown, but it's a little bit harder to determine in that particular instance because, of course, Tall Boy is designed to be a direct impact, high-speed supersonic armor-piercing bomb, whereas Grand Slam was not quite configured in exactly the same way as Tall Boy. It wasn't at its most effective in a direct armor penetration capacity, although given the size of the amount of explosive that it contained, there wasn't going to be too many things that were going to be overly fond of being hit by one. Rita Loy asks, we all know the Mark VI exploder was used in more than just the Mark XIV torpedo. What was the effect that the Mark VI exploder had on other US Navy torpedoes? So the Mark 6 exploder found its benighted place in not just the Mark 14 but also in the Mark 15 torpedo, which was the US Navy's primary surface-based torpedo, i.e. the one you'd find in destroyer torpedo tubes. And there it wreaked pretty much the same havoc on torpedo effectiveness as it did on submarines. The only slight advantage there was that the Mark 15 as a torpedo itself was subject to slightly fewer design problems as compared to the Mark 14, and also, of course, with a destroyer, it tends to have a gun battery that is obviously a significant part of its primary offensive firepower, and so whilst there were quite a few failures of the Mark 15 torpedo, it wasn't quite as deleterious on the effectiveness of US Navy destroyers as the failure of the Mark 14 was on the US Navy submarines, where of course that is the primary and in some cases the only real practical weapon of the submarine. Mikko Leitner asks, what would have happened to the High Seas Fleet if it didn't sink itself in Scapa Flow? Probably an awful lot of arguing. There was some debate within German internal high command as to whether or not they should just sink the ships anyway, regardless of the outcome of the Versailles Treaty. But certainly the admiral on the ground, Admiral Reuter, he was reluctantly willing to hand over the ships if the armistice concluded and his government, the German government, acceded to the terms that included handing over the fleet. But otherwise he was determined to sink them, which of course he did. Now, the problem here was that there were different motivations on different sides as to how exactly these ships should be dealt with. For the British in particular, they actually would rather see them sunk or otherwise destroyed. There was no question of allowing the Germans to retain a fleet, of course, of any significant size, but a lot of the German ships were fairly powerful and fairly modern. Bearing in mind the German fleet was the only other fleet that had any substantial amount, or at all, any number, really, of modern battlecruisers outside of the Royal Australian Navy, which was firmly on the side of the Royal Navy. And you had ships like Baden and Bayern, as well as a number of the later ships such as the Königs and Kaisers, plus various destroyers and modern cruisers. And whilst the Royal Navy had put some of its construction efforts on hold during the First World War, this had allowed particularly the American Navy to close the gap slightly. The French Navy was well behind in terms of construction, but this surrender of the German fleet could potentially, if everything was divvied up, allow both of those navies to come a lot closer to what the Royal Navy had, because, well, for the French, any kind of modern battleships would be a good thing, but for the Americans, whilst they had maintained construction of the Standard class during World War I, and that was enough of a concern for the British, because the Standard class, obviously with the majority of them being built during the 1910s, were significantly superior to pretty much any ship that they had outside of the 13.5 and 15-inch ships. So there was a whole slew of 12-inch ships that were already obsolete. But the Americans didn't have battle cruisers, and they didn't have modern light cruisers, and there was already rising tension on the naval side of things between Britain and America. So the last thing that the Royal Navy wanted was for the Americans to get their hands on, say, Der Flinger and Hindenburg, and use that as the core of their battlecruiser force, or indeed for ships like Baden and Bayern to fall into hands other than their own, and they didn't have any particular use for them because they liked large homogeneous classes. And some of the design aspects of the German vessels, such as relatively short range, and now that the war was over, the use extensively of coal power, didn't really sit well with the Royal Navy's operational paradigms. So if the High Seas Fleet hadn't been sunk, I suspect there would have been a fantastic amount of arguing between the various powers, with the British trying to advocate for their destruction, the French trying to advocate to probably get a fairly large block of the German ships to put its navy back on some kind of equal footing, and the Americans probably looking to snipe off particular choice elements, as I said, like the battle cruisers and cruisers, to enhance its own fleet screen, which was the one area that the American battle line was deficient in by the time of the Versailles Treaty. So all in all, it's probably just as well they did sink themselves, and the Royal Navy officers at the time did express a certain degree of relief that it rather removed the thorny question as to who got what ships by dint of just putting them all on the ocean floor. Leops 1984 asks, large caliber German naval guns used a 4-charge main charge system where part of the propellant was in a brass case whilst the rest was in silk bags. Why did the Germans use this unique arrangement? What were its advantages and disadvantages, and did it have any effects on ship design? So, for starters, the main charge, which was the rear portion of the charge, did indeed use a brass case. There is some disagreement in sources as to what happened with the forecharge, with some sources indicating that the forecharge was stored in silk bags, in some cases saying that the forecharge was stored in a tin container and then decanted for use in the gun, and still other sources, particularly Norman Friedman, states that the forecharge was actually contained in a zinc container, which went into the gun along with the shell and the main charge, and that this case was basically just consumed upon firing. But regardless, the main question is about the brass casing. The reason it was adopted was, to a certain extent, simply an extension of smaller caliber guns, where pretty much everybody used brass cases of some description. But also, the specific reasons were primarily twofold. So there was the, now in hindsight, relatively obvious advantage, and at the time, still apparent safety advantage, of the fact that a charge in a brass case is much harder to set off in the first place, unintentionally, and if it does, it's going to probably just burn in place. It's less likely to spread to other nearby charges. So there's a definite safety aspect to it all. However, there is also another important aspect to it, which was quite carefully considered by the Germans, which is the fact that breaches are never quite perfect, but if you use a big brass case and you feed that into the gun, the brass at the base helps to completely seal the breach, so you not only get slightly more power from your gun, fractionally, but it's also slightly less of a hazard to your crew, because obviously less chance of leaks and backblast, and it gives you a more consistent result with the detonation of the charge for pretty much the same reasons again. So there was a minor advantage to the use of the guns themselves, and separately an advantage to actually having a safer magazine and shell handling system, albeit that even with these measures in place, the turret fire on Seydlitz at the Battle of Dogger Bank showed that you could come dangerously close to losing your ship even with these kinds of measures in places if you neglected other safety procedures. So we've outlined the advantages. Were there any disadvantages? Well, there were a few. One of them was that obviously these kind of things weigh a fair bit and they cost a reasonable amount. Because they weigh a bit more and, well, they don't take up any more space, but it makes the whole thing a little bit more ungainly. It does mean that for a given volume and a given displacement allowance for your magazines, you can carry slightly fewer charges, which means that you either have to adopt smaller guns to maintain a similar amount of ammunition, have enlarged magazines, or have less ammunition. So that does force a little bit of an annoying choice on you. The other thing, because they're expensive, you generally want to retain and reuse these cartridges, but if you absolutely need to, you do have to dump them, and dumping them does cause a bit of a problem, because German turrets usually at the back would have ejection ports so that if necessary you could chuck the cases out. This would be for things such as even relatively mundane things, like you fired so many shots that your turret is now knee-deep in brass, which is a bit of a problem. However, this does present a weakness within the turret, and this could potentially, in an environment where you're being bombarded quite heavily, be a major problem, because in one of the late war tests, now there's a lot to be said against Billy Bitchell's test, but this particular example of a hit is informative. Against Ostfriedland, one of the bombs hit a couple of dozen feet away from a turret, behind the turret, But whilst the turret itself wasn't really damaged by the blast did travel through the ejection port openings and caused overpressure inside the turret that probably would have killed everybody inside had that actually been a real wartime thing. Now, fair enough, it was a pretty big bomb, but battleship shells are also relatively large, and that was quite a distance away, whereas you can't necessarily guarantee that shell isn't going to land nearby. So there was that weakness within the turret design for using the brass cartridges, that a near miss by a large explosion could actually knock out your turret, even if the turret itself was structurally intact. But it would be obviously quite reasonable to point out that potentially losing one or more of your turrets to near misses where the pure silk bag charge option might not have resulted in that loss is probably preferable to losing the entire ship when the magazines detonate, which certainly probably was not necessarily the factor that saved Seydlitz, but the factor that gave Seydlitz those extra seconds for its crew to flood its magazines at Dogger Bank. Samuel Sam asks, German Type 40 torpedo boats, how quick was it to rearm the torpedo tubes, and did they carry spare torpedoes on board? Well, the qualified answer to the second part is that no, they didn't carry spare torpedoes or really any torpedoes on board, because the Type 40s were never actually finished. But in more general terms, in most destroyers and torpedo boats were not designed to rearm their torpedoes whilst they were at sea. You can see from this profile drawing just how much space those torpedo tubes take up, more than, in footprint terms, more than their main guns. And you've got to remember, the main gun itself is not a consumable part of the ship's armament. The little shell that it fires is, whereas with those torpedo tubes, each torpedo is a substantial weapon, and that's especially true in torpedo boats, but also obviously on things like destroyers, etc. The only navy that had a systematic, inbuilt and designed ability to reload torpedoes in a number of its ship's classes was the Japanese Navy, but it wasn't unknown for various other navies' ships to, shall we say, acquire spare torpedoes and then reload them at sea where necessary, if indeed any of the war logs are to be believed, where you can trace a surprising number of torpedoes in excess of their design tube capacity being fired on a single voyage without any real indication that they came across a magical store ship that was able to reload them. So yeah, unofficially, it's possible someone might have snaffled up an extra G7A or two. It wouldn't be the first time that those kinds of ships had, against regulations, found somewhere to store some additional torpedoes. Although, again, being that they are fairly large weapons, finding somewhere to actually store them is a little bit more problematic than finding spaces for extra shells. Now, in terms of rearmament, if you're doing it properly with cranes and stuff in the dockyard, there's probably, well, if you're strictly in terms of, well, we have a torpedo on the cradle on the dock side and we need to lift it into the torpedo tube, the actual movement itself is probably in the order of a few minutes, albeit that the entire operation of getting one out of the armoury, etc., is considerably longer. Then you've got to prep it in the tube for firing. But in terms of rearming torpedo tubes at sea, if you're doing it in this unofficial manner, well, you've got to remember torpedoes are pretty hefty weapons. So as I've discussed before with similar questions, you're going to need quite a large body of men out there. They're going to be, some think of a risk, because the chances are you're probably moving at high speed and pitching everywhere, which is not really the best environment to be trying to jointly carry something that weighs well over a ton and shove it down a torpedo tube, albeit that in theory it is entirely possible to do so. So how quickly that would have taken, it depending on where you happen to have stashed the torpedo and what kind of sea state you're in and whether or not you're under fire, it could be a matter of 5 to 10 minutes, it could be a matter of half an hour, although I definitely wouldn't want to be on a reloading party that had to struggle with a heavy anti-ship torpedo for half an hour. You'd probably have to cycle men in and out of those work parties to avoid sheer exhaustion. Stafford Magnus asks, were blowout panels ever considered for the rear of main gun turrets to prevent catastrophic explosions in case of them being penetrated? There were a few notional studies that went into the idea, but it was dismissed pretty quickly on a number of grounds. Firstly, similar to actually the ejection panels and ports that were present on the German battleships, people realised that they represented a weakness in the design of the ship. Because, well, if you have your blowout panel, it basically can work in one of two ways. Either you have a similar thickness and weight of armour as everywhere else, just bolted in with fairly weak bolts, so that the overpressure penetrates, ruptures the bolts and throws the panel out in the event of an overpressure event, or you make that panel very thin and weak, so it will just rupture outright. Now, the problem is if you have a weaker, thinner panel, then similar to the ejection ports, the chances of a nearby hit that otherwise would leave the turret unaffected potentially penetrating through there, even if it's at the back of the turret, could potentially be a serious problem, especially in later battleship designs when you've got bombs that obviously are not going to hit specifically forward of the turret, whereas obviously normally in battle you'd expect shells to be hitting the front armour of your turrets because they'd hopefully be pointing at the enemy. If you're using the bolts situation, again, you have the problem of calibrating it precisely, because there are going to be a lot of blast events and overpressure waves occurring around the turret, both from the turret's guns themselves, from potentially, depending on which turret you're in, from super firing turrets, etc. So you don't want to make them so weak that you're losing the panel every time a nearby gun is going off. But at the same time, if you make them too strong, then they're not going to fail in time to actually allow the overpressure to exit the turret in order to meaningfully protect the turret. So this very, very fine balancing act, combined with the fact, obviously, that, to be perfectly honest, if you're in the event of needing a blowout panel on your turret, the chances are, well, twofold. One, that it's not going to help the turret at all because it means a battleship grade shell has probably penetrated your turret in all likelihood. But also, second, you've got to remember there were already gaps and such in the turret itself, such as where the gun ports, where the guns were firing out. And any kind of reasonably sized blowout panel is not going to overly contribute that much to the sum total surface area by which hot gases could escape, compared to those open sections for the guns themselves. And obviously there's some variance there depending on if there's an internal gun shield or it's canvas bagged or whatever, but still the general point still applies. Effectively, with the sheer scale of the explosion you're likely to get, the chances of a blowout panel actually accomplishing all that much is relatively slim. It will vent some of the explosion, but it's not going to vent anywhere near enough of the explosion, because you're going to have an awful lot more bang relative to overall surface area of the turret, because it's much bigger and therefore its volume has gone up considerably more, and there's more, therefore going to be more explosive in it as compared to something like a tank. But also, as hinted at in just the immediate preceding response part, when you look at the blowout panels on the ammunition storage on a tank, as a proportion of the surface area of the part that's supposed to be doing the exploding, those blowout panels are quite large. If you translate that onto a battleship turret so that you actually have a meaningful amount of venting space, you basically no longer have an armoured turret. Indy Nidel's Fursona, apparently, asks, how did ammunition handling procedures differ between destroyers with fully enclosed turrets and those with only gun shields for the main battery? Where was ammunition fed to the gun from? Now, this is a general case statement, so you are always going to be able to find the odd exception here and there, probably in both directions, to be perfectly honest. But more broadly speaking, when you had a fully enclosed mount or mini turret, effectively, such as you can see here with the twin US 5-inch 38 guns, normally in that case you would almost have a similar setup to a full-on cruiser or battleship turret, where you'd have a shell handling room below and hoists that would bring shells up to the guns. Now, when you had effectively an open mount, a gun-shielded only gun, then in that case, ammunition would be stored around the gun, both directly and in nearby ready-use lockers, and this would be your ammunition supply. Now, you could then send somebody to try and find more if you ran out, but to be perfectly honest, there was usually enough in those kinds of lockers and immediate use ammunition supplies that if you did run out, it usually meant something had gone horribly, horribly wrong, because you should have been able to break off your engagement for long enough to go and find stocks without being continuously under fire. Now, as said, this is the general rule. There were a few guns that didn't have fully enclosed mounts that did still have ammunition hoist systems, so you will find examples of that around, but as a general rule of thumb, that'll give you an idea of the difference. Bryce Stotler asks, in the movie Down Periscope, they take a Beiyang-class submarine down to 500 feet below for testing. In one scene, a character runs a line across the engine room just below the surface. When we rejoin the engine room, the line is seen to be considerably slacking from the hull, being crushed like an empty beer can. Is there some reality to what is displayed in the scene? Now, I believe this is probably the scene you're talking about. So, yes and no. In that a submarine's hull, when it's under significant pressure, when it's gone down to any kind of significant depth, yes, it will compress. So if you had a very taut line strung between two sides of the submarine's hull in an engine room or something, then as you went down, you probably would notice the line slackening somewhat. However, that slackening is probably, it's going to vary depending on the material the sub's built out of, how old the sub is, how good quality the material still is, the exact width of the submarine hull, thickness of the actual hull plating itself, and so on and so forth. But generally, for horizontal compression, i.e. across the room, you might expect a compression of half an inch to maybe a couple of inches, again depending on size. If it's a relatively small sub, the compression is going to be less. If it's a big sub like a nuclear missile sub, then it's going to be more proportionally in terms of the actual length. And then obviously a more modern sub is going to compress less because it's made usually of better quality steel than older subs, and so on and so forth. So I probably wouldn't expect quite the drop of string that you see there, but it probably would be visibly noticeable. If you were to somehow, and for some insane reason, open up all the bulkhead doors and assume they're all in a straight line, you could somehow string a taut string front to back, then you would probably notice quite the significant drop, because obviously lengthways the compression is going to be considerably more in absolute terms. Captain Landlocked asks quite a considerable question. Ships from the age of sail can be clearly shown to be the product of Mediterranean and Atlantic building techniques and rigging systems coming together to form superior ships than the regions individually had before. Yes. To my knowledge, this has also happened comparatively swiftly in the 15th to 16th century. Yeah, near enough. In contrast, there seems to be no impact on Asian or Polynesian boat building or rigging in European shipbuilding. My questions would be, A, is that true, or am I just oblivious to their impact? And B, do you know if such topics were discussed by European shipbuilders or navies before the end of the 19th century? I'm thinking especially about stuff like crab claw sails, junk rigging, outriggers, and catamarans. To be honest, it depends on the size of ship, and also where exactly you draw the line at Asian boat building and rigging, and where that transitions to what you might call, say, Middle Eastern boat building and rigging. Because certain elements, such as, say, the lateen sail, or lantine sail, depending on how it's spelt, actually those kind of things do come from much further east than the sort of conventional European-Mediterranean developmental area. And they're adopted in part on larger ships, but very much especially on smaller ships, such as brigs and sloops, because it offers a significant degree of superior sailing performance under certain conditions. Now, the main thing is that these other boat building traditions, the Asian and Polynesian ones and the European ones, they evolve in very different circumstances, and a ship is an integrated system. So a given particular sail form will usually develop in such a way as to complement the most commonly used hull form in the area, and in turn the hull form will be adapted to the prevailing sea conditions, both in terms of weather and in terms of shallowness, etc., etc. And so where you have, say, a Chinese junk, which with a few minor changes is pretty much a mainstay for hundreds, if not thousands of years, they've got to contend with the Chinese coast and the Western Pacific, whereas European ships, whilst the Mediterranean is somewhat calmer, and this is why you see very lightly built ships like galleys last a lot longer there, when you talk about the North Atlantic and the North Sea, that's an entirely different kind of environment, and that in turn demands an entirely different type of ship. Also, to be perfectly fair, the European environment was a lot more competitive when it came to warship design, which kind of forced development a little bit further along than you might otherwise have, because, well, when you look at the sort of Asian environment, the various Indian princely states, whilst a few of them did have navies of varying descriptions, with a number of rather interesting warship designs, broadly speaking, they were mostly concerned with land-based issues, and so there wasn't really a massive drive towards huge navies or warship development. Then, when you look slightly further east, you've got big powers such as Japan, for certain periods of time, China, obviously, Korea. But again, where is their focus? The Chinese, for a long period, are going into self-isolation. So whilst you can quite easily argue around the time of Admiral Zheng He, the Chinese, technologically speaking, are massively ahead of European powers when it comes to their shipbuilding capabilities, they don't really develop that much beyond that because they go into this isolationist phase. The Japanese are mainly concerned for a long period of time with fighting again amongst themselves on their own islands, so they've got a lot of coastal craft but not too many or need for ocean-going vessels. And the Koreans have got to worry about the Japanese and the Chinese, so with relatively small amounts of shipping to hand, they've got to focus on a lot more of defensive measures. And those kind of criteria or similar ones can pretty much be applied across the board with all the other various Pacific area powers. They're either too small, too focused on land, or have to worry about very, very major competitors to actually meaningfully talk about building up a significant ocean-going war fleet. Whereas in Europe, there's this constant power struggle between Spain, France, the Netherlands, the England-Britain, depending on what time period precisely you're looking at, for the Atlantic and North Sea areas, and then obviously in the Mediterranean you've got a whole load of other things, the various Italian kingdoms, and initially the Ottoman fleets, and then later others such as the Russians. So there's a lot more closely matched competition that thus forces generally ship technology to get a little bit ahead by the time you're talking about the classic age of sail. Now, in terms of very, very specific adaptations and adoptions of technologies from certain environments in Asian and Polynesian ship design, because generally speaking by this point Western ships are much larger, you don't see too much adoption of stuff there, but you do see some general adoption of their shipbuilding techniques when it comes to some of the smaller vessels, both colonial vessels in the area and occasionally other vessels elsewhere in other parts of the world. But it's somewhat more limited and somewhat more, if you want, scattershot. It's sort of picking off odd bits and pieces, as opposed to wholesale adoption of complete building techniques. Now, in the 18th and 19th centuries, there was actually a reasonable degree of discourse amongst various European ship architects and shipbuilders about these various sort of odd ships that they were finding in other parts of the world. But to be perfectly honest, an awful lot of the techniques and designs that they were talking about basically kept running into the will it survive a North Atlantic storm? Yes or no? and that was pretty much the end of that for a lot of the designs, because, as I've covered in other videos and other dry dock responses, the prevailing weather conditions in these different environments do have massive effects on overall ship design and ship practice. SDF7 asks, given variations on the method date back to Fulton's Nautilus, could you elaborate a little on what differentiated the Dutch snorkel from prior attempts, or more simply, why did it work that time and move into widespread use? It boils down to two main factors: technology and opportunity. Specifically, the technology to successfully pull off something like a snorkel is only really available in the 1910s onwards, and pretty much that's when you also see the first successful patents for something like a snorkel coming into existence. And that's because, well, you've got to let as much air in and out as possible, but you've also got to slam things shut very quickly and very tightly when the sea washes over it. Now, you can, in theory, do this with mechanical systems like floating valves and things like this, but with the sudden change in conditions that happens when the sea overwhelms a snorkel briefly with a wave peak or something, combined with the fact that on board a submarine, especially early submarines with open lead-acid batteries, you really can't afford much, if any, water to come on board at all, and especially anywhere near your batteries. A snorkel system that allows in even a little splash of water when it gets overwhelmed is very rapidly going to build up to an unacceptable level of water, and really any water is practically unacceptable, especially with the early subs. So you need an electromechanical system that can respond a lot quicker with a lot more definitive a seal, and this is the kind of technology that you see actually coming about in the 1910s and 1920s. So that's the technological side of things. It's then a matter of the opportunity side of things, because whilst the technology is there, it is a relatively speaking complex, finicky, and something of a maintenance hog of a system, even when it works properly. And bearing in mind that back in World War I, which of course at that point in the 1910s and 20s has been the most immediate experience of submarine operations, the need for something like a snorkel really hadn't been there. Whilst aircraft had been around, they weren't the kind of massive threat to submarines that they would be in World War II, and similarly the kind of prosecution of attacks without things like advanced hydrophones and ASDIC sonar, although they did have some hydrophones in World War I, the attacks just generally wouldn't last that long, or if they did, they'd become progressively more and more inaccurate. So again, the need for a snorkel system it wasn't there. It wasn't worth installing this highly finicky, difficult to maintain, and to be fair, with the displacement of submarines even by the 1920s, relatively weighty system. When, well, what was the use case going to be? When were you actually going to find any utility in it? Whereas by the late 1930s, aircraft have developed significantly more of a threat. You do have advances in hydrophone technology and the early developments in ASDIC and sonar, and all of a sudden there's a lot more of a threat to submarines, and so now the disadvantages of using such a system are now actually outweighed, if you have one, by the advantages present in being able to hover just below the water surface and recharge your batteries, or run your diesel engines, or both. And so it's kind of this perfect storm where the Dutch develop a system that basically works, and then they suddenly find the system falling into the hands of people who really actually need it right now, and thus it becomes significantly more widespread as opposed to earlier versions. Silver Fox 575 asks, when did the tradition of naming ships start, and where did it come from? In terms of where it came from and when it started, thousands upon thousands of years ago, verging almost on prehistory. As for where, it arose in a number of locations. I mean, we know, for example, that the Egyptians and the Babylonians at the beginnings of their civilizations appear to have ship naming ceremonies, so they're definitely in the running, but to be honest, at that point you're talking about so far back that we have fragmentary records even for civilizations like that. So it would not surprise me in the slightest that other civilizations contemporary to that period, both in the sort of Fertile Crescent area and elsewhere, probably had similar practices. It's just that for one reason or another we haven't recorded them quite as well, or we haven't found the records of them. As for why, it's basically a case of sailors especially are a bit of a superstitious lot, and to be fair, when you see what the sea can do to you, you can kind of understand why. If you're going to put yourself out to sea in something like the ships of those ancient mariners, you definitely want absolutely everything you possibly can get on your side, and so, again, depending on the culture, the naming of the ship might be done to please a god or goddess in order to allow them to give you good fortune, or give the ship good fortune and you happen to incidentally benefit from it, or it might also be, in some cases, that it was a culture that believed that objects of given size and complexity could be imbued with their own kinds of spirits, and so and I know this kind of verges a little bit on sounding a bit like Warhammer 40,000 with machine spirits, but, well, it's fiction based on quote-unquote reality for a reason. Certain cultures did believe that something like a ship would have a spirit of its own, and this could be appeased, or it may be angered, and that may then have positive or negative effects for you. So if you gave this ship that had been constructed a pleasing name, that might encourage the ship to treat you well, and it might also imbue certain characteristics to the ship in order to assist it and therefore you in your voyage. And sort of the confluence of that would be the naming of a ship for a particular quality or person or deity that would, in theory, give the ship greater capabilities and also encourage said deity that you may have named it in favour of to give you favour as well. Of course, exactly why and how ships are named has evolved. The reasoning there behind that has evolved over time, but you can still see some of it reflected in ship names even now. I mean, nowadays, hey, fair enough, a lot of ships, especially warships, are named to reflect the pride or honour of a country or a state within a country or a city within a country, but there's still an awful lot of, now, fair enough, relatively traditional handed down names that still reflect those much older practices. I mean, there's a reason that ship names, well, if you're going to take the Royal Navy as an example, but you'll find this carried over in a lot of other navies, names like Neptune, Poseidon, Bellerophon, Mars, etc., show up quite often. George Armatas asks, do you think it would have been possible to make the Fairey Fulmar a single-seater? It probably would have made it a much better fighter, and the observer really wasn't necessary. It would cut lots of weight and probably make it more manoeuvrable as well. I mean, in theory, yes, you could take out the position and glaze it over. Practically, it's probably not going to help all that much, because the Fulmar is a big aircraft. You can't just cut out that observer section and weld the front and back together. That's going to horribly affect the aerodynamics, and it's still got a massive wing. And, I mean, to be perfectly fair, for the period it was designed in, the two-seater made a certain amount of sense. The thing is, as with awful lot of stuff that was developed in the mid to late 1930s, technological evolution rapidly overtook it to the point that it was, in a lot of cases, obsolete before it came into service. I mean, it wasn't completely hopeless. It did have a certain number of successes, but as an actual fighter against other enemy land-based fighters, and by the sort of 41, 42 enemy carrier-based fighters, yeah, it's not brilliant. The interesting thing is actually that there was a program in place in sort of 3940 to develop a carrier-based version of the Spitfire, and no, that's not the Seafire as we understand it. It was actually a radically different design with a kind of cranked gull wing, so it looked a little bit like a fusion of an F4U Corsair and a Spitfire more than anything else, and that would have involved new, stronger undercarriage, obviously better landing characteristics, better viewing characteristics, etc. Probably actually would have made a devastatingly effective single-seat carrier fighter, but unfortunately around about the same time that was beginning to show some promise, it also suddenly became a point that, well, every single Spitfire was needed for home defence for what would eventually become the Battle of Britain, and unfortunately that then died a bit of a death. So if you're looking at the kind of the Fulmar introductory period of 3940 and looking for a good single-seat fighter, that's probably the one that you want to go for. Just taking out the observer in the Fulmar, yeah, it's going to give a slight performance improvement because slightly less weight, etc. But in all honesty, it's probably going to tempt people to get into situations that the plane just really cannot handle, because, as I said, it's still a massive aircraft and not the world's highest performance one at that. Christopher Dent asks, what is your opinion on smaller quick-firing guns relative to larger guns with separate ammunition? As an example, as a destroyer captain in a surface fight, would you rather your ship be armed with quick-firing 4-inch guns or 5-inch guns with semi-fixed or separate ammunition? In that specific circumstance of destroyers, I would much prefer a quick-firing gun with single-piece ammunition than a 2-piece ammunition gun, and that's for a number of reasons. Primarily because with single-piece ammunition, that generally means it's single-man portable, and in turn that means it's much quicker and easier to load, which means in turn you're going to have a much higher rate of fire. It's less complex, less things to go wrong. The fact that it's going to be slightly smaller in terms of destructive power, most likely, isn't really so much of a problem when you're dealing with destroyer versus destroyer fights, because if you're going to be lobbing that kind of ammunition at each other, the sheer rate of fire, as well as obviously the quicker, hopefully, accuracy that you're going to get out of the guns, is going to more than offset the slightly smaller bursting charge that you're going to have. And on a ship the size of a destroyer, hitting first, hitting fast, and hitting hard is much, much more important than getting a single big shot in. So, yeah. Smaller gun with single-piece ammunition all the way for destroyer fights. It's only really once you get up to things like battleships, secondary batteries, that you can afford to have multi-piece ammunition with greater individual hitting power, because things in a destroyer versus destroyer fight, even with the best possible circumstances outside of sheer luck, you're going to be winning by battering the enemy with multiple hits anyway, whereas fair enough, with a battleship you may only get 1 or 2 hits on an enemy destroyer before it's too late and it's launched torpedoes, in which case you do want those shells to be the biggest and nastiest possible. So it makes sense to have slightly larger guns for the secondary batteries of a battleship as compared to the primary guns of a destroyer. Cypher asks, which navies in 1939 showed the most and least advancement-improvement over their 1918 navy? If you look at the major navies of the various major combatants, so US, UK, Japan, France, Russia, Italy, then least advancement-improvement, that's pretty easy. It's the Russian Navy, or the Soviet Navy at the time. To be fair, they had, the entire communist revolution in the interim, combined with Stalin's almost criminal neglect of the Navy, which didn't really help. But whereas everybody else had built at least some new battleships and plenty of cruisers and destroyers and such in the intervening period, the Russians had questionably updated and modernized some of the gangets as far as capital ships went, and that was it. They didn't have any carriers, they didn't have any new battleships, although they were trying to build some by the time World War II broke out. In terms of their cruisers, for heavy cruisers, they'd made some rather questionable design choices. I mean, the list of problems with the Kirov class cruisers at the time that they were actually built, well, it was so long you probably could have used the reports as extra padding for the ship's armour belt. And yeah, the less said about some of the other interwar Soviet light cruiser designs, the better. They were beginning to come up with some vaguely solid destroyer designs, but even there, it was a little bit hit and miss with the Italian-influenced destroyers they were coming up with. And yeah, generally they hadn't made that many great improvements. As opposed to the most advancement-improvement over their 1918 Navy? Well, it's technological advancement and improvement. Also, it has this weird segue with actual sort of fighting power. And 1939 is a particularly difficult one because, admittedly, using capital ships is a little bit of a niche thing because there are obviously things like submarines, cruisers, destroyers, and all those sorts of things. But it's a good indicative. And so you look at, say, the Italian Navy. The Italian Navy didn't have any super dreadnoughts in World War I, so it couldn't compete with the likes of the US Navy, the British Navy, and the German Navy. They were going to get the Littorias in service, but they weren't ready by 1939. The French are in a similar boat. They've got Strasbourg and Dunkirk, but neither of those would exactly be classified as top flight battleships, even though they're relatively decent ships in and of themselves. And again, the Richelieu's not ready. So I guess that leaves us with Japan, Germany, Britain, and America. Germany has some effective designs and some pretty poor ones. Again, their big battleships, the Bismarcks, not ready in time. And overall, compared to their 1918 Navy, the High Seas Fleet, Germany's come down quite a few notches in the world. So that leaves us with the big three: Japan, Royal Navy, and the US Navy. So in terms of advancement and improvement, technologically speaking, in a lot of ways, the Royal Navy actually has the most advancement-improvement over the 1918 Navy, in that they're the ones who, in 1939, are ahead on radar, they're ahead on ASDIC, they're ahead on fighter control and direction, and as we discussed in last week's Drydock, weirdly enough, they're actually ahead on carrier aircraft as well. And so on and so forth. Now, there are sort of areas where the Japanese and American navies have advantages. So, for example, the Japanese have obviously things like the Long Lance torpedo, and both the Americans and the Japanese have aircraft carriers that can deploy significantly more aircraft in standard operational conditions for 1939, as opposed to the British. And the Americans have the better of the dual-purpose secondary guns, dash destroyer main guns in the 5-inch 38. So there are still plenty of areas where those other navies have also gotten to sort of world-leading technological levels. And then, of course, the whole thing is slightly obscured by the fact that immediately post-39, the Royal Navy goes into war, and the other two get another couple of years of peacetime. But if you compare the Royal Navy with its 1918 form, although technologically they've come a long way, they have been constrained somewhat by budgets, and in 1918 the Royal Navy was the unchallenged master of the seas. It was the biggest navy in the world by a long distance. In 1939 that's not the case. The US Navy was kind of post the High Seas Fleet Scuttling, was then the second largest navy. They're now the first, they're sort of not first largest, they're the equal first place with the Royal Navy. And as we said, they've made a bunch of technological advances as well. They've refitted and modernized ships, and they've got new ships coming into service. The Japanese are certainly a lot stronger in 1939 relative to the US and British navies than they were in 1918. And they have a number of technological advantages compared to everyone else that they didn't have in 1918. However, in terms of their larger capital ships, in 1939 they're still stuck with the Nagatos. They haven't quite managed to persuade Yamato to come into service yet, whereas the British and the Americans have heavily refitted and modernized some of their older capital ships, and they've got the North Carolinas and King George V are a lot closer to coming into full service than Yamato is. So yeah, I would say on balance, if you're looking at technology and ship modernizations and such, like, the Royal Navy probably slightly edges it. If you look at overall where they sit relative to where they were in 1918, the US Navy probably slightly edges it. Edward Starling asks, during the 20th century, many badly damaged ships were scuttled rather than risk capture. What was the main reasoning behind this? Feared that the enemy would get a technological insight into the systems and construction of the ship in question, or that the enemy would repair the ship and use it against its former country. Were there any examples of capital ships being captured instead of scuttled? So there's a threefold purpose to it. One is propaganda-pride, 2 is actually the ease of scuttling, and 3 is the relative balance of power as compared to earlier periods. Now, the first reason, propaganda-pride, in the 19th century, particularly in Britain, but more generally, in part as a result of the sheer prestige of the Royal Navy, was the fact that Navy prestige generally, and particularly the prestige of owning large ships, had gone up massively in value in people's perceptions. So, whilst the bigger ships were always the pride of the Navy and the pride of the country in question during most periods of naval activity, by the time you entered the 20th century, whereas, let's say in 1795, the idea of losing a first or second rate in battle would be seen as a great tragedy and something to be avoided if it was captured, it was something that was kind of like, well, that was very bad, let's try not to repeat that again with our next set of ships. Whereas, by the 20th century, it had been built up to the point of, if one of your battleships or battlecruisers got captured by the enemy, it would be national humiliation. You'd be a laughing stock. I mean, you look at the number of ships present again, the Battle of Trafalgar is this wonderful little microcosm, because there's a couple of captured British capital ships on the Franco-Spanish side, and there's a whole ton of ex-Franco-Spanish vessels on the British side, and no one really blinks too much at that. It's like, oh, well, it was on our side, now it's on their side, let's try and get it back. One side had a bit more success at that than the other. Now, so yeah, there's the propaganda pride part of it. It was not seen as anywhere near as conscionable a thing to happen as it had been in previous times. I mean, you look at HMS Pegasus, which is the ship that's gracing this particular question. That's the last Royal Navy ship to surrender in World War One. Well, at all, but the surrender happens in World War One. And, I mean, it's an out-of-date protected cruiser. It's not really worth much to the Royal Navy, but the fact that it hauled down the white ensign and ran up the white flag was a huge deal at the time. Now, if you transplant that back into the age of sail, its equivalent may be a battered, worn-out 6th-rate frigate on its way to the breakers anyway. People were like, oh, we lost a frigate, that's irritating. Hope it put up a good fight, and that would have been the end of it. The second part is, ships were actually a lot easier to scuttle by the 20th century than they had been previously. The thing is, naturally, wood is buoyant. So a wooden ship, whilst it can founder because it's full of overly non-buoyant things like ballast and guns and people to a certain extent, they're actually very difficult to sink without smashing them into rocks and getting them to break up and such. So scuttling a wooden ship is, in the time that you'd be trying to do that, it's almost, not entirely, but almost unheard of. You either have to set the thing on fire, which is very dangerous for you as much as anything else, or you have to get your carpenters to start going chiseling holes in several feet of oak in the bows of the ship, which one is going to take forever and a day, and two, carpenters, like most people, have a survival instinct, and yeah, good luck persuading them to do that. Whereas once you enter the era of iron and steel, you can actually sink a ship relatively easily just by opening some valves and seacocks and letting the water in, and that's pretty much that. Because a iron and steel ship is not naturally buoyant in and of the materials, it's only buoyant because of the air that is held within the hull. So yeah, the fact is it's just so much easier to do, which makes it a much more viable option. And third, the balance of power, because kind of similar to the pride and prestige thing, but at the end of the day, the loss of a frigate, or even a third rate, or rarely a first rate, in and of itself, it would be an annoying blow for a large navy, but it's not a fatal blow unless we're talking a very, very small navy. I mean, heck, even with the US Navy, when they had the 6 big frigates, the loss of something like the Chesapeake and the President, a third of the original 6 frigates, it's not an overly crippling blow to what the US Navy is capable of doing, because they can always build more. And similarly, the number, if you just look at how long the Napoleonic Wars lasted, the sheer number of ships captured on all sides, and especially by the British, didn't stop the Franco-Spanish Navy being a threat and especially the French Navy, pretty much up until the end of the war, because ships could be replaced, relatively speaking, easily. And they were just present in so much greater numbers. Now, if you look at, again, the Battle of Trafalgar, the number of capital ships present there is more than the number of capital ships present at Jutland, if you're looking at battleships only. And yet, whilst it is a big fleet engagement, it's not the only fleet that either side has. There are more Franco-Spanish ships of the line, the first, second, and third rates scattered around their various ports. There are entire other fleets of Royal Navy ships of the line, such as the one under Admiral Calder that had fought a few months earlier and turned the Franco-Spanish fleet back from the Channel while Nelson was pursuing them. So, but when you look at the modern era, say, Jutland represents almost every single capital ship afloat in the 2 largest navies in the world, and after that, with the Navy treaty restrictions and everything, hull numbers go down even further, so the potential turning or loss of an individual vessel actually represents a significantly greater change in the balance of power than it ever had done in the Age of Sail, especially a large vessel. So you definitely didn't want your enemy to get their hands on something like that, because even if it might have been a bit of a problem for them to operate, if they can operate it at all, it's still something that's been turned against you. You also do have the problem of the technology on board that the enemy might get access to, which, depending on the country in question, could be a major problem, especially if you're talking about like modern fire control systems and radar, etc. But there are a lot larger issues behind that. And in terms of examples of capital ships captured instead of scuttled, not in the major naval wars of the 20th century. There are some examples of countries' flagships or otherwise larger vessels in their navy being captured in the 20th century, but that's on the smaller naval scales. There's no battleship that's captured at sea or battlecruiser that's captured at sea in the 20th century once you get past the era of HMS Dreadnought. Of course, Tsushima, there are a number of battleships captured. John Rees asks, what were some of the more interesting ways navies tried to combat aircraft? Well, the 2 most interesting and indeed quite commonly known weird and wonderful ways were the Japanese Type 3 anti-aircraft shell, aka the let's turn a battleship shell into a collection of gigantic single-shot flying flamethrowers, which awesome as it sounds, didn't turn out to be that much of effective as an anti-aircraft weapon. Then, of course, you have the British unrotated projectile launchers, as seen here aboard HMS Nelson, which follow the principle of let's try and create a three-dimensional aerial minefield and hope the wind doesn't blow it back onto our own ship, which, again, sounds really cool, but worked about as well as you might expect. And then for the Wooden Spoon prize, you have the initial placement of the 3-inch anti-aircraft guns on various US Navy warships, which, as can be seen on a video I recently retweeted, did have the rather irritating side effect of being a small high-mounted platform that was completely open to the elements and subject to very considerable blast from the main guns. So, yeah, considering how high up they are and the kind of sort of climbing the crews would have to go and to get to them, unlike the more conventional main deck mounted anti-aircraft weapons, those crews would probably be at their action stations if the main guns had to go off, and there's not really a lot they can do, because if there's one place you don't want to be that's even worse than in an open platform next to a small anti-aircraft gun whilst battleship guns go off underneath you, it's even closer to those guns on a ladder. Bale Enioros asks, what did the Axis do surface-wise in the Mediterranean post-Italy's surrender? Did they manage to achieve any notable successes? Post-Italy's surrender, or switching sides, depending on how you want to look at it, there wasn't an awful lot of surface action, to be perfectly honest. The vast majority of continuing Axis action in the Mediterranean was by submarine and by air attack. So U-boats were still around for a while, and obviously air attack, to be honest, construed the vast majority of German anti-surface activity. Their surface-based units mostly consisted of some anti-submarine warfare efforts, which were curtailed relatively quickly as the Allies advanced into Italy, and the occasional foray by mine layer. In probably one of the biggest successes they had in that respect was this particular mine layer, originally called, I'm not even going to try and pronounce it in Yugoslavian, but it was called Dragon, except in Yugoslavian, captured by the Germans when they invaded and renamed Drache, or Dragon, and by this point she was being used as a mine layer, and that managed to take out with one minefield 2 destroyers and damage a third before both fighters caught up with her, as can be seen in this picture. And that was probably about the biggest surface-based success that the Germans had post the Italian surrender in the Mediterranean in World War II. Bert Clothier asks, British Pathé, or Pathé, I don't know how that's pronounced, British Path, shall we call it, recently posted a video of a newsreel from 1949 celebrating the return of HMS Royal Sovereign to the Royal Navy after service under the Soviet flag. This caught me off guard, as I'd never heard of this before. I'm sure I can find the answer through other sources, but it'd be more fun to hear your story of the ship and the reasons it went into Russian service. Basically, it comes down to, weirdly enough, given what we were just talking about, the Italian surrender in 1943. Because once that particular treaty had been worked out, there was still a war going on, but there was the issue of divvying up the loot. Always an interesting activity for the victors of a war. And it was decided that war loot reparations whatever you want to call it was due to various combatants involved, which somehow, given the Italian Mediterranean theatre, involved the Soviet Union. And what the Soviet Union had asked for and received, in theory, or at least on paper, was a number of Italian warships, including the battleship Giulio Cesare. There were a number of complications involved with this, like the fact the Italians weren't particularly keen on the idea, and Giulio Cesare was in the Mediterranean, and, well, Russia was very far away. And so, eventually, it was decided that until everything had calmed down a little bit and it was possible to actually sort out sending Giulio Cesare over to the Soviet Union, the Royal Navy would effectively supply a substitute ship, and that was HMS Royal Sovereign, renamed to Arkhangelsk, I think. That's how you pronounce it anyway. And that promptly became the single largest vessel in Soviet naval service and was used to escort convoys on the latter part of the Arctic convoy routes. So that was all fun and games. After the war, then the British sorted out getting Giulio Cesare to the Russians, and they were effectively said, well, can we have our battleship back, please? The Russians initially, no, we have the battleship, and you don't, and we don't really want to give you the battleship back also, so we're going to claim that it's not actually seaworthy and it wouldn't survive the journey anyway. At this point, immediately post-World War II, relationships hadn't broken down to the point that British officers were entirely excluded from Russia, and they were able to pop over and have a look at the ship and kind of say, well, actually, that's kind of nonsense. The ship can make it home. Whether the Russians actually wanted to keep something as old as Royal Sovereign, or whether they were just embarrassed by the state it was in, I don't exactly know, but it could be either, because when it turned back up in the UK, it turned out that it appeared the Russians had never actually revolved the main guns, and so in the sort of half-decade or so it had been under the Soviet ensign, especially when you consider just how bad the weather and conditions, etc., are in the Arctic Ocean, the gun turrets were basically frozen in place. You would not have ever gotten them to move. I don't think they make WD-40 in cans that big. And so that was just a single case point within an awful lot of other subsystems. The ship was still seaworthy, but as a warship, it was basically shot. It could move backwards and forwards, and that was about it. And so, unfortunately, the thing had to be scrapped because there was in no way, shape or form was it justifiable to repair it. And that was the end of HMS Royal Sovereign, aka Archangelsk. Paul from Chicago asks, the Battle of Passchendaele was conducted, ostensibly, to destroy bases of raiding U-boats. I posit this was the final blow to the British sea power state, as this was the moment the government replaced naval power with military power, a government policy supported by both Liberal and Conservative parties. Agree or disagree? I would tend to disagree, to be perfectly honest. Capturing the U-boat bases by land did seem to be, in some respects, a slightly less costly way of disrupting the German submarine campaign as opposed to sending in ships. Albeit, well, the Battle of Passchendaele - Third Battle of Ypres, not exactly the world's most bloodless battle, to say the least. It's a very unique circumstance, to be honest, because whilst, yes, the army does have a lot more of a role in British political calculations post-World War I, and obviously you also have to factor in the existence of this new service of the Royal Air Force, which hadn't existed prior to World War I, and indeed was still the Royal Flying Corps for the majority of it. The sea power of the Royal Navy was still a massive part of government policy that was necessary, largely because Britain had an empire and troops can't really walk on water. They still need to get from point A to point B, and the only way for them to get from point A to point B, when you're talking about the British Empire generally, is to go by ship. And to go by ship safely, you need a navy. And ideally, the enemy, to get to you, usually has to come by ship, and it's much, much quicker, easier, and more effective to sink an enemy invasion convoy when they're at sea with warships than it is to let them land and then have to fight it out in an area where your troops are potentially going to be surrounded, outnumbered, and outgunned thousands of miles away from home when the enemy would quite conceivably be a lot closer. And you can see that during the interwar period, and when the critical rearmament phases came along. Whilst, yes, obviously the Royal Air Force did receive a big boost, the Army received a big boost of funding, the Royal Navy also got a fair boost of funding. The main reason why you don't tend to see quite as much of that effect by the time war breaks out in 1939 is simply because naval stuff takes a lot longer to build. You can build a tank in a matter of weeks, you can build a plane in a matter of weeks. You can't build a battleship in a matter of weeks. So, and also battleship costs a lot more than a single plane or tank. So if you're trying to build up your air force, you can turn air force of mostly biplanes into one of mostly monoplanes in a couple of years, you can turn a force that's mostly got light tanks into something approximating medium to heavy tanks in a couple of years, but you'll only be about 2/3 of the way through a single battleship modernization in a couple of years. So, yeah. The Navy is an item that is very much a long-term strategic item, and the fact that everything changed so quickly in terms of both naval treaties and then rearmament in the interwar period does put the Navy on a bit of a back foot, unfortunately, but it's not really sidelined as the primary arm of British striking power pretty much actually until the Cold War, when the whole British Army of the Rhine and the focus on Russia becomes a thing. Video Dude 26 asks, in the Leander class video you mentioned the Royal Navy's light cruiser conundrum. That got me thinking about the sloop exemption under the 1930 London Naval Treaty. Did the Royal Navy ever seriously consider using sloops as surrogates for light cruisers in the commerce protection role? Sure, with a treaty limited top speed of 20 knots, they're not going to be running down any commerce raiders. However, if all they accomplished was to drive said raiders off, then, well, as far as commerce protection goes, mission accomplished. With a maximum armament of 4 6-inch guns, they had a punch that would certainly make a light cruiser sit up and take notice, particularly if they were deployed in pairs. The Royal Navy did think about it, and Dr. Alexander Clark on his channel actually has a couple of videos on sloops and other such light vessels and the thinking that was going into them during the interwar period. However, the Royal Navy viewed sloops primarily as an anti-submarine potentially anti-aircraft escort, not so much of an anti-surface escort, because when they did their various studies, they concluded that in order to drive off the average light cruiser commerce raider, it wasn't just a matter of you have 4 6-inch guns. It was the same issue that came back with the number of guns on battleship main batteries in the Dreadnought era in the 1900s, which was that you needed a minimum number of guns for a decent salvo, and you also needed those guns to be fairly well coordinated. Now, one of the big advantages of sloops was that they were lightweight and cheap, and once you start adding in heavy fire control directors and training mechanisms for the guns, they swiftly become less and less cheap, and you start pushing the weight limits quite considerably. So they did think of the idea of a diminutive for commerce escort only, but that was the Arethusa class, as pictured here, which well, not exactly, but in appearance-wise, they look a lot like Leander's minus one of the rear turrets, the super-firing one. And that's with 6 guns and direct controlled firing, etc. That was pretty much the minimum they considered as a useful escort, where you were potentially having to face off against enemy cruisers. And also, that's light cruisers. Now, a 4 6-inch gun sloop, yeah, that could pretty easily, especially in groups, stand off against an armed merchant cruiser of some sort, like the Cormoran. However, one, its slow speed means you have to have quite a few of them deployed across the convoy, because you're probably not going to be able to respond if you're on, say, the back left of the convoy and the enemy armed merchant cruiser appears to the forward and starboard area. If you've only got a maximum speed of 20 knots, you're probably not going to be able to respond fast enough, so you need a lot of them. And on top of that, you've also got to take into account that you're not just talking about enemy light cruisers of a caliber of the Leander. So maybe if it was something like a Tenryu class, then yeah, a couple of sloops could stand off against it. If it was a Königsberg class, well, a couple of sloops could probably survive long enough for the Atlantic to take the Königsberg for them, but if it was something like a Mogami class, a Cleveland class, or something along those lines, then, to be perfectly honest, no realistic amount of sloops is going to stand off against something like that. And then you've also got to think about, especially for the Royal Navy, what they were looking at in terms of ships that they might have to face as surface raiders was more along the lines of things like the Deutschland class and the Admiral Hippers, And obviously, if you're talking on the Japanese side of things, the Miyokos, the Atagos, etc. And those kind of things, as I say, no reasonable amount of sloops are actually going to deter. Even an Arethusa is definitely not going to stand much of a chance against one in straight-up combat, but it might just about possess the volume and accuracy of fire, especially with its torpedo launchers as well, to deter such a raider, at least long enough for the convoy to scatter. So, yeah, unfortunately, if it had just been light cruisers the Royal Navy had to worry about, they might have gone with some kind of heavy sloop design in multiple numbers. But once you introduce the really big light cruisers and the heavy cruisers into the equation, you need something with just a bit more punch. Peaceful Conquest asks, I was reading about William Hall, the first black man and first Canadian sailor to receive the Victoria Cross. I was surprised to see that although he was serving aboard HMS Shannon, the action for which he received the Victoria Cross occurred in Lucknow, which is very much inland. That led me to a few questions about British naval brigades in the Victorian era. Firstly, how well did naval artillery compare to their shoreside equivalents in the Royal Artillery when it came to land-based combat? And secondly, was their use more of an ad hoc, well, you know how to work a gun and we're in sudden desperate need, so get off that ship and lend a hand, or something that was part of a planned overall strategy for the British Empire at the time regarding deployment of forces, or something else? So generally speaking, naval artillery tends to compare very favourably with land-based artillery if you're looking at guns of approximately the same calibre. And that's because, as I think I've covered in a couple of other dry docks, land-based artillery at this point is moved purely by muscle, whether that be men, horses, mules, oxen, whatever. And so weight is a huge consideration, which means that quite often in land-based artillery you get relatively short-barreled artillery to save on weight, and you also tend to get lighter artillery for the relatively sane reason that humans are a lot squishier than warships, and so you don't need a particularly large gun to take out men and cavalry in fairly effective numbers, and obviously a smaller gun allows you to have a greater rate of fire. There are, of course, sieges and such like where you do need heavier, longer range artillery, but that is a very specialist item, and there's not too many of them. Now, obviously, the Royal Artillery, they exist, and so they have their own artillery, but the vast majority of it is this lighter field artillery. Whereas on a ship, once the gun is actually mounted, broadly speaking, it's more the range and the firepower that's important as opposed to the weight, and so the average naval gun will be of a longer barrel, and thus more powerful, generally more accurate, and also longer range. Secondly, when it comes to the Victorian deployment of naval artillery, it's kind of a halfway house between the scenarios you describe. It's certainly not the army co-opting naval artillery units onto land. They were two separate services, and the Royal Navy, especially the captains of the ships, would probably look at any army officer trying to Shanghai his men into being the army's artillery support with quite a lot of displeasure. However, the flip side to that was that in and of itself, the Navy was usually quite happy to go ashore and help out the army. I mean, obviously, there's the inter-service rivalry part. No naval officer is ever going to really pass up the chance to go, yes, army troopers, yes, I will come and help you. You will definitely need my help now. Look at the glorious Navy and its wonderful artillery. But also, for the majority of the 19th century, obviously at the beginning of the 19th century, you still got Napoleonic Wars going on, but for the classic sort of British Empire period, the mobile units of the army, i.e. the units that would usually be sent out to deal with colonial trouble spots, are very much light infantry - cavalry. There's not a vast amount of artillery that gets hauled around. And so when you have scenarios where an army unit needs artillery support, quite often the nearest and most accessible artillery of any great numbers and firepower is going to be the guns of the ships that brought them there. And since the guns could be dismounted, and they did have carriages for the lighter ones like 12-pounders and 4.7 inches and stuff like that, and for some of those sort of middle caliber and the larger ones, the Navy was pretty good at improvising carriages as well. You would very often end up with ships putting their guns ashore to help with the campaign. It did occasionally happen in the Napoleonic period as well, but in the Napoleonic period where there was a serious naval threat, it was less common because obviously you need your guns just in case an enemy warship shows up, whereas in the British Empire period of the 19th century, the chances of anyone actually showing up with a warship to try and challenge the Royal Navy were pretty much slim to none. So detaching some of your guns along with some of your crew to man them, because obviously naval gunners trained in how to use artillery, and for them having a fixed position where nothing is moving relative to them is wonderful for sieges, because compared to firing guns from a ship, this is a walk in the park. Yeah, you'd see a lot of these naval gun detachments put out. Famously at the siege of Ladysmith, the cruiser HMS Powerful landed a number of its guns to help with the relieving of that particular siege in one of the Boer Wars. And ultimately, at the end of the day, if push really came to shove, anything of sort of cruiser size or above that was wandering around the oceans would possess guns with far more destructive power than anything the regular army artillery was likely to possess pretty much anywhere. So, although it was rarely, if ever, used, the option to land a 7.5 or a 9.2 inch gun or something of that ilk, basically something that could just about be physically moved, it did exist, because outside of European land armies, out in the colonial areas, there was no answer to that kind of firepower. Assuming, of course, that you could get it to the target. Wienve asks, how reliable is the Antony roll as a source for the Tudor Navy? I assume the illustrations are not to be taken quite literally, but how do you figure out what to take seriously and what not to when studying a source as old as this? So the Antony roll is actually a surprisingly accurate depiction of the Tudor Navy for the period that it was created in. Now, that doesn't necessarily extend to the illustrations themselves. I mean, here's the Great Harry, and, well, any half-decent student of art will be able to work out that, well, let's just say the Great Harry was a very powerful galleon. It was not, however, a four-dimensional space-time warper, which is what it would have had to be for this particular profile to be entirely accurate. However, it still does have some value in an illustrative capacity, is that the general outline of the ships is broadly considered accurate, although the exact number and placement of the guns, not so much. For example, those two guns either side of the rudder, that's not going to happen. The back of the ship was not flat like that all the way down. And there's also some question as to some of the exact positioning of some of the stern guns and such, like they just appear to be appended on. And obviously we have most of the wreck of the Mary Rose, which we can compare against her depiction in the Antony roll and see where the differences lie. However, the reason why the Antony roll is such a useful source for the Tudor Navy is in part because it gives an idea of some of the softer details, such as the number of flags and bits of heraldry and stuff that were put on the ships, which is something you don't often see in a lot of purely written records, and as far as anyone can tell, that part is actually pretty accurate. The Tudors did love themselves some flags. However, the main value of the Antony roll comes from the written part, because it's not just a pretty picture book, it is actually a fully itemised list of the capabilities, firepower, crew, etc. of the ships in question, and it's that written part that is the more valuable for the historians who are trying to analyse the Tudor Navy. And broadly speaking, this is kind of a general rule of thumb for most of the various navies' records at the time. Is what you're looking at primarily designed to show off, or is it primarily designed to be a bureaucratic record, or is it somewhere in between? Because the record-keeping sides of things at this point, and indeed quite far back into naval history, are actually pretty good. If a naval record says this ship had 32 guns and it had Of that, maybe 15 were minions and 3 sakers, 4 culverins, and a few cannon. It's pretty much certain that that is exactly what it had. If it's accompanied by a picture that happens to show it carrying like 13 bombards and a small dragon, then you probably don't regard the illustration quite as much. And so this is why actually resources like the anti-roll are incredibly useful, as opposed to even some of the larger and more grandiose artistic depictions in things like paintings, where, of course, A, artistic license is always taken, and B, with the best will in the world, quite a number of artists drew ships without ever actually having seen them. That's not to say all artists are that bad. A number of artists did quite carefully and with great consideration study the ships that they were painting before they did so, but it depends what the focus of the painting is. Quite often, a lot of depictions of Navy ships in this period are kind of background images to something else, whether that be the people or the other places that are being depicted. Anthony Kobeck asks, why did the Beiyang Fleet of the Late Qing Dynasty fail so poorly during the First Sino-Japanese War, perhaps focusing on the Chinese ironclad Ding Yuan? Well, this has been addressed in a few dry dock questions before, so quickly and briefly, it was a combination of a couple of factors. One of which was human. The crews didn't have a particularly great amount of training, the officers didn't have a particularly great amount of experience, and there was a huge amount of corruption in the fleet, all of which meant that their fighting effectiveness, with a lack of training and equipment, was not brilliant. That's not to say they weren't brave, they certainly fought very, very hard, but at the end of the day, a very, very hard fighting but inexperienced and untrained crew is usually going to lose to an equally hard fighting but well-trained and well-led crew. The other factor is technology, which kind of sweeps around a little bit to the corruption angle as well, because when it comes to that side of things, a ship like Ding Yuan was very powerful at the time that it was launched. But this was the late 19th century, and what constituted very powerful and what constituted obsolete could be separated by a period of as little as 5 years. And the ship had been in service with the Chinese Navy for a little while by the time the First Sino-Japanese War broke out, and the necessary funds to keep the thing updated hadn't actually been forthcoming. Well, they'd initially been forthcoming, but they'd been diverted to other things that weren't Navy related. And so even though it was just over 10 years old by the time the war broke out, technology had advanced to the point that it was slightly behind the times. It was still a big ironclad and proved very difficult for anything that wasn't another ironclad with equally large guns to actually sink, but it was also relatively ineffective compared to what it could have been if it had been given the small refit and upgrades that had been planned for it in the early 1890s. That would have made it a lot more capable, and that would have, to a certain degree, made up for some of the deficiencies in training amongst the crew. Not necessarily sure it would have changed the overall outcome of the Battle of the Yalu River, if indeed we can ever come up with a coherent narrative of what happened at the Battle of the Yalu River, but it certainly would have allowed it to do something a bit more than it actually did. Appalachian Tiger asks, how exactly would one lay mines from a submarine? Does it involve specialist equipment, tactics, etc.? It depends greatly on the system in question. So, broadly speaking, there are 4 ways that you can deploy mines from submarines, as well as a number of weird and wonderful unique methods. But the 4 general methods, starting with the crudest, which is literally, especially with World War I, World War II vessels, strap mines onto the deck of the submarine and kick them off when the sub's on the surface, a bit like you if you're a conventional mine layer. It's a bit risky, but it means you can use pretty much any submarine in extremis as a mine layer, although you really, really want to get rid of those mines as soon as possible. So perhaps more useful for emergency laying of quote-unquote friendly minefields, that kind of thing. The second is to come up with some form of mine that can be launched through a conventional torpedo tube. Now, obviously, those mines aren't going to be anywhere near as powerful as the really big ones, but again, it does allow you to repurpose almost any submarine as a mine layer. Now, when you've got submarines with dedicated mine-laying facilities, this tends to take the form of one of two versions. Either you have a kind of upwards firing or almost upwards firing mine-laying tube, or series of tubes, usually mounted in the bow of the submarine, which to a certain extent kind of looks like a very primitive early version of the vertical launch system cells that some modern submarines have for launching cruise missiles, and in these you would stack 1, 2, maybe even 3 mines depending on the size of the submarine, and as you sail along you would open one of the hatches, a bit like a torpedo tube hatch, and you'd pop out however many mines were in there, and hopefully you were moving slowly enough that the mines would pop out and float up and away, arming themselves well after your conning tower has sailed on past. That's one way of doing it. And the other way, which for the majority of World War I and World War II was by far the most common for either submarines that were dedicated mine layers or submarines that had dedicated mine laying facilities, was a kind of conveyor belt system. So this might take the form of 1 or 2 long conveyor belt type arrangements with a bunch of mines on them, and these would feed into, again, 1 or 2 mine-laying tubes. So these would be considerably larger than a torpedo tube, and so there were fewer of them. Usually these would be mounted in the stern, and as the submarine sailed along, it would just deposit the mines one after the other. Kind of like how you'd fire a torpedo, but with somewhat less use of compressed air, because you're not actually firing it in any particular direction, you're just kicking it out the back of the submarine far enough that it doesn't hit you on its way out. So yeah, there's some specialised equipment, although you don't necessarily need it if you're going to adapt existing subs and are prepared to accept some compromises. Tactics-wise, well, submarines are supposed to be sneaky. So sneak around, get to an area, and then sail in, roughly speaking, a straight line as you deposit one line of mines, then hopefully remember where that line is before turning back and laying another line of mines that's closer to home, and so on and so forth until you're out of mines. Trey Atkins asks, has technology ever advanced in such a way that outdated ships could beat a newer model because the defences against it fell out of use, or something like that? Yes, a few times this has happened, but depending on exactly what time period you talk about, there are a number of qualifiers. So actually, weirdly enough, looking at the Chinese Beiyang Fleet, although the 2 ironclads in question were theoretically a little bit out of date and obsolete by the time of the Battle of Yalu River, the jeune école thinking that dominated the French and at the time Japanese navies was calling for more numerous lighter ships with quick-firing guns and torpedoes. So that was the new technology, at least for as far as their technological line of development was concerned. And it turned out that a ironclad that was just massive in the sort of physics sense of just having this sheer mass of iron armour was actually, contrary to their expectations, pretty much proof against almost anything they could throw at it. I mean, later on it did get torpedoed, which was a bit of a problem, but in gunfire terms, actually one of the things that came out of the Battle of the Yalu River was a fairly significant discrediting of the jeune école style, because no matter what they threw at it, shell-wise, the Chinese ironclads just would not die. And if they had had a little bit better training and upgraded weapons, etc., it could have been a very, very different fight. So that's one consideration. So late 19th century, people who think that the light ship is the way to go, no, the older ships would have beaten you there. In the more modern era, well, if anybody had a gun cruiser or similar floating around still from World War II, if, and this is where caveats come in, if one of those things with radar-guided fire control, etc., got into visual range of a modern fleet, that modern fleet would be pretty stuffed, because most modern deck guns are single 4.5 or 5-inch weapons, and fair enough, they can fire very rapidly, they've got radar-guided fire control and everything, but at the end of the day, they are still what in World War II considerations would have been destroyer caliber weaponry, which a large light cruiser or a heavy cruiser would be relatively well protected against, and modern ships do not have, in any way, shape or form, any kind of appreciable armour against shells. So if you were to say have something like a Des Moines, even HMS Tiger for that matter, a Worcester Town class, Baltimore, something like that, especially Des Moines, if one of those things just rocks up at 10-15 miles for whatever reason and starts blasting away, it's going to be a lot of very dead modern ships very, very quickly. CIWS isn't going to help you much. CREB isn't going to help you much against incoming rapid-fire 8-inch salvos from a ship like that. So, yeah, the defense to that is to have more and bigger guns yourself and armour. Modern ships don't have armour. They do have missiles, but the time it would take them to lock on and salvo out enough anti-shipping missiles to break something like a Des Moines, I think the Des Moines, if it's pulling the trigger at the same time, is going to be the one that comes out the winner in a one-on-one there. And those are the two most obvious examples, but generally speaking, as a rule, and you might actually see that coming through as a theme even in those, when this kind of scenario tends to happen, it tends to be because technology has advanced incrementally rather than revolutionarily, and people decide for whatever reason that this means that they can build newer ships much smaller, much lighter, much faster, much more cost efficient, that kind of thing. Which is fine as long as they're fighting other ships of a similar disposition, but then they come up against some big old clanker of an ancient vessel that just has the sheer mass to absorb the little pinpricks that the modern ships can throw at it, and in some cases just sheer protection as well, and keep on trucking right up until it's on top of them. And then at that kind of shorter range, the more modern nature of weapons doesn't actually make too much odds. So yeah, that happens at various points in things like the Age of Sail, and even as far back as ancient times as well. Oddball0311 asks, I was watching Dr. Clark's videos on back pocket cruisers, and when he was outlining the Daring class, he mentions how the 4.5-inch guns are fitted on upper deck mounts as opposed to between deck mounts. What are the differences between the two, and what caused the delay in their development? So the difference is, for lighter guns, how is that gun mounted within the ship? An upper deck mount is also sometimes called a transferable mount, and this kind of mounting is, well, effectively the easiest way to explain it would be, if someone says, I want to put in a gun mount, and its classification is upper deck mount, literally all you need to find is, do we have some clear deck space? You don't need to worry what's below the deck, you don't need to worry what's running under the deck, you don't need to worry about any of that, it's just, do we have some clear deck space, and is there anything nearby that will be affected by blast effects? If there isn't, then great, we can stick something down, literally bolt it to the deck, the gun is now in place. Job done. Might have to connect up some power cables or whatever, but that's about it. And then if you want to take out that gun mount, again, it's unbolt it, get a crane, lift it off, and you'll have exactly the same thing you had before, maybe a couple of bolt holes in the deck, and that's all. Whereas a between deck mount is a mount where a lot of its associated machinery and so forth actually involves going down into the deck itself, and then in that case you have to worry about, okay, what's the deck below this proposed mounting location, and so on and so forth. So it's more akin to a cruiser or battleship style barbette and turret arrangement where the mounting pierces the deck. So if you, again, go back to your scenario of, well, we found this clear patch of deck space we want to put a gun mount on, if it's a between deck mount, someone's going to have to break out the cutting torches, cut a nice circular hole usually in the deck, drop the mounting in, so you're going to have to consider what's in the deck below, and what might be affected there, possibly further decks below, depending on exactly how much between decks we're talking about. And then if it comes to removing that mount, you are going to be left with a soaking great hole in your deck, which is going to be something of an issue. So it's a lot easier to move upper deck mounts around, and it's a lot easier to install them, and it's also a lot better, especially on something the size of a destroyer, because you can then make use of the space directly beneath as well. So unless you specifically want to install other systems, with an upper deck mount you can literally bolt it on, and then you could be sitting directly underneath the gun on the deck below, and apart from the occasional bang echoing through the deck, you're not going to know anything about it. Whereas with a between deck mount you can be like, well, here's a bunch of working machinery, I guess I'm going to have to go somewhere else. It also means a ship with upper deck mounts is much better placed for upgrades if necessary, because again you can just unbolt it, lift it off and drop in a new system, as opposed to if you've got a between deck mount you then have to start thinking when you're designing the new system of, okay, well, its machinery between decks is so wide, is that going to involve us having to cut more of the deck away? Is it going to leave us with a gap? Are we going to have to put in some kind of plating to marry them up? Is it going to go deeper? Is it not going to go quite as deep? Are we going to have to put supports in? That kind of stuff. Whereas with between deck mount, an upper deck mount, it's literally, we've taken one gun off, we're now putting an approximately similar sized gun on. Happy days. The flip side is, of course, that if you're developing an upper deck mounting, you've got to fit absolutely everything in this mount above the deck, which means you're going to have to either invent some new and increasingly inventive technology, or you're going to have to sacrifice certain capabilities, or you're going to have to make everything very compact. And all of these present various challenges, whereas with a between deck mount, because you just have more space, you can introduce more features more easily without massive compaction and innovation of systems. So it's easier to make a more capable between deck mount, but a upper deck mount of the same capability, whilst it will be more expensive and more complex to construct, offers greater utility. Because apart from anything else, especially if you're talking about things like secondary batteries on cruisers or battleships, the upper deck mounts can be installed in far more locations than between deck mounts can be, and far more easily. William Tyson asks, is it true that the German 12-inch guns were superior to the British 12-inch guns? I keep hearing the former had significantly higher velocity and hitting power than and that the German 12-inch was similar in performance to the British 13.5-inch. It's a surprisingly common and depressingly common meme, if you like, that's been going around for a while. A lot of people will say when you point out that, well, German guns at Jutland and other places in World War I just weren't as big. They're like, oh yes, but the German 11-inch gun was just as good as the British 12-inch gun, and the 12-inch was just as good as the British 13.5-inch. No. This is not the case, not by a long shot. Now, whether or not the German 12-inch gun was superior to the British 12-inch gun, that's a completely different question. Yes, the later versions of the German 12-inch gun, such as what you would find on, say, the Der Flinger, or in this particular case in front of you, the Hindenburg, those were superior to the British 12-inch guns. In some part due to modernity. The guns on Der Flinger and Hindenburg and, well, Lutzow, as long as it lasted, were 50 caliber guns, whereas the majority of guns on the British ships were either the relatively decent 12-inch 45 caliber weapons, which tended to, obviously, they're not quite as capable, they're slightly shorter barrel weapons, not quite as high velocity. And it's a known fact that, to be perfectly honest, the British 12-inch 50 caliber weapon was not the world's greatest by a fair distance. So it's entirely fair to say the Germans had a better 12-inch gun in that respect. Fine. However, there's a difference between being in the upper echelons of firepower as far as 12-inch guns go, because if you want the absolute upper echelon of firepower for 12-inch guns, you actually have to go to the Russians with the ones on the Gangets, and then trying to say that somehow this makes them equal or near equal to the British 13.5-inch weapon. A lot of the time people point to various armour penetration tables, like, oh yes, well look, the armour penetration values are close. It's like, or in some cases superior, it appears. It's like, no, again, with the German armour penetration tables, they show the effect of different types of shell, in this case armour-piercing shell, when they're fired in fully operational wartime condition, i.e. with armour-piercing caps, etc. Whereas the British armour penetration values for, say, the 13.5-inch gun that are most commonly available, and the ones that most people go for, they are for shells that are not capped. So they don't have their armour-piercing cap on. If they did have their armour-piercing cap on, which obviously they would do in wartime, then they have considerably more penetration power. And this is actually noted, if you look at the British entry for the 13.5-inch gun on NavWeps, this is actually noted in their footnote 2b on armour penetration. It notes that a capped shell would have about 10 to 20% improvement in penetration at low velocities and 30 to 50% improved penetration at high velocities as compared to the data tables given. And the reason I use that is, well, one, NavWeps is a pretty decent source for all things naval artillery-wise, and two, because it has nice shiny tables, a lot of people like to quote it, often without actually bothering to read into significant amounts of detail as to what it's actually saying. So, yeah, once you take that into account, you actually see that the armour penetration capabilities of the 13.5-inch go up to a point where they are considerably better than the German 12-inch at any kind of given range. And you basically end up with a scenario, roughly speaking, once you've calculated it all out, that at the kind of battle range you're fighting Jutland at, which is sort of in the mid to low teens of thousands of yards, generally speaking, the German 12-inch gun doesn't quite have the armour penetration capability to punch through the typical armour of a British battleship. And at the slightly longer ranges, it can't quite make its way even through the 9-inch armour of the British battlecruisers, which is something of a problem. The other thing is, with a much lighter shell, the German 12-inch gun will lose velocity much faster, which means that its armour penetration drops off very rapidly between 10 and 20,000 yards as compared to the heavier 13.5-inch shell. Now, granted, obviously the British did have a number of significant problems with their armour-piercing shells in the early and mid parts of World War I, with them detonating prematurely, but that's a shell design flaw, not a problem with the gun. When the shells are actually working properly, the penetration of the British guns at similar ranges is higher enough that it actually is then capable of punching through, again, assuming the shell works properly, pretty much any armour that the Germans have present, even though the German battleships and battlecruisers on average carry thicker armour than their direct British equivalents. So there's that, but there's also, when it comes to just power, what happens once the shell penetrates. And I know I've mentioned bursting charges quite a bit, but when you compare the bursting charges of the British 13.5-inch shell against the German 12-inch shell, you find that, depending on the exact shell variant, but on average, the British shell has about a 50% greater bursting charge, which means that when the shell actually penetrates and detonates, 50% more explosive power. Now, there is obviously a scaling issue in that just because you've doubled, say, the amount of explosive doesn't mean you're necessarily going to get double the effect, but it still is, it's a big enough chunk of explosive in addition that is going to make a difference relatively significantly to the amount of damage that's going to be done. And the most amusing thing about all of this, I mean, obviously this isn't to denigrate your particular question because you're reporting what you've heard, but the people who spread these kinds of effectively naval myths is that they maintain this position in the face of the testimony of the navy that they are supposedly defending, because the Imperial German Navy, the High Seas Fleet, one of, if not the single biggest lesson that came out of Jutland from the High Seas Fleet was Admiral Scheer going up to the High Command and the Kaiser and going, "We need bigger guns." The Mackinsons were due to have bigger guns, but as a result of the lessons of Jutland, that's what was the direct cause of the ersatz Yorks being redeveloped from some of the later Mackinson hulls with even bigger guns, and the L-20A Alphas, or whatever they're called. Again, their design was revised for bigger guns because the German Navy recognised that their 12-inch guns did not have the firepower of the British 13.5 and definitely 15-inch guns, even with the malfunctioning British shells. So they were determined to get much bigger guns much faster. So if the Navy who owns the weapon has decided they need a bigger gun, chances are they probably need a bigger gun. This is one of the constant amusements I find with a lot of these naval myths, like, say, for example, with the debates over armoured flight decks versus unarmoured flight decks for carriers, or how much did the US Navy and the Royal Navy learn from each other during the USS Robin deployment, and all sorts of other things. We're like, oh no, well, everything was absolutely perfect on my chosen side. And it's like, okay, now here's the actual reports from the people of the Navy that you are supposedly saying everything was fine and superior in, and the actual naval officers are saying different. The actual naval officers are saying we need to learn this, we need to adapt this, and it happens on both sides in those scenarios. If the Navy officers say that actually our existing systems are not 100% perfect and we need to make them better, chances are they probably need to make them better. Corvus asks, you have mentioned that the UK hasn't as many museum ships as it might have because there just wasn't enough money to go around. Once the useful bits have been removed and repurposed, if a ship had cost X amount, what percentage of X could be expected to be recovered on scrapping? Also, would the armour plate that was so much effort and expense to make be retained as such, or just thrown into the furnace with the rest of the structural steel? So basically, when you sell a ship for scrap, you're going to get a negligible amount back compared to the cost of building the ship. And for ships that have had a long service, the amount of money that will have been sunk into refits, repairs, etc. is going to balloon that even further. I mean, if you look at something like, say, HMS Dreadnought, in 1905, 1906, when she's built, she costs just under £1.8 million to go from keel laying to in service. When she is scrapped in the early 1920s, even though there's been obviously inflation and such, they get just under £40,000 back as scrap value. So compared to almost 1.8 million, you're just not going to get much, if any, return on your scrap value. You get something, and obviously when ships get larger and there's more valuable elements in them, you can expect a slightly higher rate of return, but it's not even going to be 10% of the value that you put into building the ship in the first place, let alone all the value sunk into the ship in the process of keeping it in service and refits and repairs, as we said earlier. So some specialist items will obviously be useful. Now, the scrapper obviously expects to make a profit, so it's not actually the true value of the ship. I mean, it's much like with your car. If you smack your car hard enough into a solid object that it's a write-off, its scrap value that you might be able to sell it for is actually going to be usually a lot lower than what your insurance will pay out, because, at least in the UK, your insurance has to pay out the actual value of the car as opposed to what they can get for it at scrap, because the scrap dealers want to make a profit. And so, yeah, you bash in your front end. Well, your scrap value of an old car might be 50 quid, but if the tyres are relatively new, each of those tyres might go for 40 to 50 quid already, and let alone lights, wiring, internal fixtures, other body panels, etc., and so on. So it's the same thing with a warship. The scrappers will not pay all that much for it, but once they break it up, various components, the brass, the bronze, the high-grade steel, electronics, etc., they'll probably the sale of any one of those items as a collective whole will make them a lot more money than they actually paid for the whole ship as scrap. When it comes to things like the armour plate, that's very niche. Some of it would just be sold off as very high-grade steel to be used in other circumstances, reforged or resmelted. In some cases, it would be sold on to other very specific purposes. I mean, there's a number of gun ranges, both in the US and the UK, and I believe one or two in France as well, where their backing plates are literally old armour plates from various scrapped warships, which is a somewhat prosaic usage of the armour plate, but it also had other values in things like bunkers, blaster chambers, and other testing facilities as well. So, yeah, some of the more critical components could be reused in situ, but to be perfectly honest, when you're talking about potentially upwards of 10,000 tons of high-grade armour steel, a lot of that is just going to end up being sold as high-grade steel that needs minimal work to reforge into something different. Chris Gregory asks, as most ships, even warships at war, spend much more time sailing than fighting, which warship classes of the Second World War had the best seaworthiness and or seakeeping qualities, and which classes had the worst seakeeping or seaworthiness? The answer can vary quite a bit depending on the exact sea conditions you're talking about, but broadly speaking, some of the best seakeeping ships were ships like, say, the County class cruisers, very high-sided, very nice and stable. The Bismarck class, because of their width and their extreme stability, were very nice ships at sea, as long as the weather didn't get too bad. Then they tended to be rather violent moving ships, but that's a qualified case, I guess. For destroyers, the Fletcher class were actually pretty good sea boats. I mean, obviously they are going to get thrown around and bobbed around quite a lot because they're destroyers, but for destroyers, the fact that they were pretty stable and had the right distribution of weights meant that they were more comfortable than most. And at the other end of the spectrum, in terms of bad seakeeping and seaworthiness, well, the German Königsberg class are a wonderful case in point in that they're so awful that they're not actually really fully ocean capable, which is a bit of a problem, really. The King George V class were pretty seaworthy, but their seakeeping was actually, in heavy weather, pretty awful because of that very minimally raised, if at all, bow, which tended to just take loads of water over the bow. So yeah, at high speeds and in bad weather, the King George V tended to more excavate their way through the ocean than anything else. And for different, but also bow-related reasons, you obviously have things like the Iowas with their wonderful tendency of knifing their way through the seas and spraying the resultant mess back up into the main batteries. But there is a fine distinction there, because both King George V class and Iowa class ships were incredibly seaworthy, whereas the Königsbergs just weren't, i.e. assuming you retain engine power, at the end of a massive Atlantic or Pacific storm, you would expect a King George V or an Iowa to still be there. You'd probably have put money on the Königsberg not being there anymore. Whereas seakeeping, which is sort of keeping the water where it should be, which is not on top of the ship, in that respect, yeah, the Iowas and King George V, not the world's greatest designs in that particular manner. Snowstalker36 asks a number of questions, so of course, in line with Drydock rules, I will answer one, and the others can be reposted for the next month. So first question, given how well rapid-firing 6-inch gun cruisers such as the Brooklyn and Town classes ended up performing for the US Navy and Royal Navy, would the Japanese Navy have been better off leaving the Mogamis in the original 6-inch configuration? There are so many issues with switching to the 8-inch guns for the Mogamis. Stability issues, build quality issues, etc, etc. Practically speaking, yeah, I think they probably would have been better off. Apart from anything else, if they'd kept all their 666s, then they probably would have been forced to look for something other than that for the Yamato class secondary batteries, which would mean, well, I mean, the Yamatos ended up with a lot of secondary weapons anyway after various refits, but it might have encouraged them to look more towards the anti-aircraft defense of those ships a little bit sooner. I mean, overall, there's not really any engagement that the Mogami class took part in where having more numerous rapid-fire 6-inch guns would have been any significant disadvantage over the 8-inch guns, really. And there are a couple of scenarios where they would have done a lot better. I mean, for example, the Battle of Samar is a classic one because I'm pretty sure that if you'd had, say, Kumano chucking out dozens and dozens of 6-inch shells in rapid succession, Johnston probably wouldn't have lasted anywhere near as long as it did when Kumano's firing 8-inch guns, obviously much slower, fewer shells, and with a lot more over-penetration going on. So, yeah, I mean, to be fair, some of it is a little bit of hindsight, but overall, 6-inch armed Mogamis probably would have done marginally better than their 8-inch gun versions, albeit they still would have ended up as an exciting collection of artificial reefs courtesy of the US Navy, but that's neither here nor there. Edmund Ressor asks, what are the differences between a large cruiser, a heavy cruiser, and a battle cruiser? Did a super heavy cruiser exist? It really does run into a lot of very political naming conventions, to be perfectly honest, because you've also got to factor in super cruisers and such like. And then there's the eternal debate over what exactly is the role, purpose, design, etc. of a battle cruiser, which is an entire matter of its own. But the heavy cruiser is a creation of the naval treaty system in the interwar period, because prior to World War I, you had protected cruisers and armoured cruisers. Then the armoured cruiser kind of died a death, evolved into the battle cruiser, depending on exactly how you follow naval design tradition. And so you had light armoured cruisers or light cruisers, or just cruisers coming in, and then with scout cruisers as kind of the diminutive. Then the treaties force this division between the light and the heavy cruisers. So a heavy cruiser is defined in the treaty manner as a cruiser with an armament of more than 6-inch guns, but less than or equal to 8-inch guns. So that's, and typically the heavy cruiser would be built with an 8-inch main battery. A large cruiser, well, there's not really so much a large cruiser, but a large insert designation here, so large light cruiser, for example, is generally a bit of a political smokescreen to disguise the fact you're actually building something that definitely is not that. But by calling it a large insert other thing cruiser, you can pretend that it is that other thing cruiser, just a bit bigger, which makes it easier to get funding. This is the same kind of, should we say, inventive naming that gets you things like the through-deck cruiser that turns out to be the Invincible-class aircraft carrier, or the Japanese helicopter destroyer that, honestly, Gov, isn't actually an F-35B capable aircraft carrier. And yeah, Admiral Fisher's large light cruisers, which turn out to be HMS Furious and HMS Courageous and HMS Glorious, which in no way, shape or form actually meet any kind of definition of light cruiser, large or otherwise. You then have this sort of, towards the end of the 1930s and into the 1940s, this subtle division between battle and super cruisers. Now, in my opinion, at least, and this is a subject of debate amongst naval historians, so different people will have different opinions with equal amounts of evidence to back them up, but a super cruiser is, to me, an outgrowth of existing heavy cruiser designs, which means they may have either more of the same guns, maybe like 12 8-inch guns, or they may have heavier guns, but not guns that come up to battleship scale. So an Alaska class would be a good example of a super cruiser, because although 12-inch guns at one point were battleship scale, at the time that Alaskas are being built, the 15, 16 and 18-inch guns are battleship guns. So a 12-inch gun is no longer a modern battleship caliber, but it is greater than the 8-inch. So there's that. Also, super cruisers tend to have armour more comparable with cruisers, more generally, all possibly slightly scaled up. In a lot of ways, the super cruisers' protection, speed profile, etc., resembles the earliest battle cruisers, the Invincibles. It's just not the main armament equivalent, because obviously back when the Invincibles were built, the 12-inch gun was a battleship caliber weapon. And whereas battle cruisers, again, in my opinion, tend to be more along the lines of battleships where you have increased the speed, slightly downrated the armour compared to what you would be otherwise capable of doing, and usually slightly reduced the gun firepower as well. So in this respect, when you look at the Invincibles, or any of the British battle cruisers really, as a general rule of thumb, when you compare them directly to, at least until you get to Hood, when you compare them to their battleship equivalents, they carry the same caliber of weaponry. They just tend to carry one less turret. So the Invincibles carry 8 twin 12-inch, the Dreadnought carries 10, the Lions and its derivatives carry 8 13.5-inch turrets, whereas their battleship versions, the Orions, King George V, Iron Dukes, carry 10. The Renowns, they carry 6 15-inch guns in 3 twin turrets, whereas the Revengers, which they're derivative of, carry 8 15-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, and so on and so forth. So, broadly speaking, with the Germans, it's kind of similar. Sort of Seydlitz, Moltke, etc., carrying 11-inch guns, just in slightly fewer turrets, and then Der Flingers carrying 12-inch guns in slightly fewer turrets, and their battleship equivalents are carrying the same guns, just more of them. So yeah, a battle cruiser is kind of a rebalancing of the capital ship, the battleship model, as opposed to a supercruiser, which is an outgrowth of a cruiser. So until you get to the rapid-firing gun stage of immediate post-World War II, broadly speaking, you would expect a battle cruiser to easily beat a supercruiser in a one-on-one gunfight. Because actually the best example of that is Blucher. Blucher is kind of prototypical supercruiser relative to its immediate contemporaries, loses quite hard in a fight with actual battle cruisers. But a supercruiser will be slightly cheaper to run and will be just as effective against normal cruisers, because the battle cruiser against a normal cruiser is just a massive sledgehammer to crack a nut, whereas perhaps a supercruiser is a geology hammer to crack a nut, but that nut is still very much cracked. So yeah, that's at least my way of going around things. Super heavy cruisers, well, that's just a supercruiser, basically, something like an Alaska. I mean, you can even make a certain argument for Des Moines being a supercruiser, because it's pretty chunky compared to a Baltimore, and although it doesn't carry any more main guns, it does have considerably more firepower thanks to the autoloaders. Dave Collier asks, can you tell the story of the phrase "the world wonders" and its usage in the Battle of Leyte Gulf? So this all derives from actually a relatively clever trick that the US Navy put into its enciphering program to try and ensure greater signal security. One of the oldest tricks in the book for deciphering enemy communications is to look at the start and end of a transmission, because through human nature, an awful lot of transmissions are just written in a normal fashion, then encrypted, and most people include either salutations or greetings at the end. So you might say, "Yours sincerely," or "Dear Sir," or "Admiral so-and-so," or in the Germans' case, they really like putting Heil Hitler in practically everything. Now, if you happened to know that this was a relatively common practice through other intelligence, then you could start looking at the various encrypted signals, and then if you knew that, say, every message sent by a certain set of transmitters began with the phrase, "Hello, everybody," you could start analysing the patterns between the characters in the opening part of each transmission and try and work out what's the differences here. We know it says "Hello, everybody," so we can work back the individual cipher, but then by comparing the differences between the various encrypted characters and the different messages, we can also work out how the cipher is constantly changing. And once you've broken that, you can break through into the rest of the message, and all of a sudden you know what the enemy is doing. Now, to make sure that that didn't happen, the US Navy introduced a system whereby you would have your message, whatever that was, and then you would have to append a 3-word nonsense phrase to the start and the end. And because this would be completely irrelevant, completely unrelated to the message itself, and would obviously change completely at random every time, this kind of identifying the forward and aft parts of the message, if you like, to try and pull common themes from it, wouldn't work. And because these would vary obviously by length, because you could say start a transmission with yes 1 2 1 2. Oh well, not 1 2 1 2, but you start with yes 1 2. So that would be 9 characters. Someone else might choose their nonsense phrase to be something like Michigan Pacific Stroganoff, which obviously has a lot more letters in it. And so if you're trying to look for, oh, well, so many letters in, we're going to find common phrases, it's not going to work either. And you do that at the end as well, so that cuts off the potential like yours sincerely or whatever being commonly picked up. Now, you could just use completely random jumbles of words. You could use completely random jumbles of letters that vaguely resembled words. But, again, human nature usually meant that people would pick code phrases that actually made sense as some kind of 3-letter sentence or saying, because it's just easier to remember and much easier for the human mind to come up with. Now, when it comes to the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Admiral Nimitz wanted to know what the heck had happened to Task Force 34, which was the heavy covering force that Halsey had talked about leaving behind to cover where eventually Centre Force would approach and then start attacking Taffy 3. So he sent a message that was basically saying, where is Task Force 34? So specifically, because he wanted to know exactly where this thing was, his message was, where is, repeat, where is Task Force 34? Which is a relatively standard, if slightly strident, naval transmission, but nothing particularly out of the ordinary. Once, obviously, other data like who it had come from and such had been appended on, and then the nonsense phrases had also been appended. The 2 nonsense phrases that were installed on this transmission were Turkey Trots to Water and The World Wonders. And the idea to help with deciphering at the other end was that these things would be separated from the main message by repeat letters. So in this case, the full transmission was Turkey Trots to Water, GG, and that's the separator, from SyncPack, Action Com 3rd Fleet, info, ComInch CTF 77, X, so that's all your metadata as to who the heck it's from and to. Where is, RPT, repeat, where is Task Force 34? RR, there's your separator again, The World Wonders. That's the full text of the transmission. However, for whatever reason, the poor old decryption officer on the USS New Jersey missed the RR for whatever reason, even though other stations that picked up the transmission didn't, but I don't know, whatever, maybe it might have been a bad day. So instead of getting a question of where is Task Force 34, Halsey instead got, where is Task Force 34, The World Wonders? Which, as you can tell, has a slightly different tone to it. Yeah, it's something of a slap in the face in that particular manner. Now, to be perfectly fair, as I'll probably make my feelings clear on, Admiral Halsey probably deserved a transmission like that when it came to his handling of his forces in and around the Battle of Samar. But still, whether he deserved it or not, it was significantly stronger and more sarcastic than in that form than Admiral Nimitz actually intended it to be. And so, yeah, it had a rather interesting effect on Halsey because, yeah, if a naval superior actually deliberately sends you a message like that, they are not happy in any way, shape or form. Especially in the US Navy. You might get a smattering of light sarcasm in the Royal Navy here and there, but the US Navy is not known for being overly sarcastic in the orders it gives to its subordinate officers unless somebody is really, really making a point of just how badly you have stuffed up. Mark Millett asks, from Tomichi Hara's account of the Battle of Vila Gulf, he noted that the spacing between the destroyers was about 500 metres. Is this spacing about typical for ships in a line of battle in the Second World War, and would it change significantly if the ships were cruisers or non-carrier capital ships? It varied greatly depending on the ship and depending on the circumstances in question. So, typically speaking, for a night action, ships would be closed up a lot closer in than in a day action. But this could vary. Again, if you're destroyers, you can pack them in a lot closer because a destroyer is more agile and is a physically smaller ship, as compared to a cruiser or battleship, which might be less wieldy and so would require a little bit more spacing just in case of change of speed or manoeuvring. But at the same time, when tactical issues called for it, even large ships could close up a lot closer. So, for example, although it's not a Second World War example, you look at the Battle of Jutland with just under 30 capital ships in Admiral Jellicoe's line of battle. That line stretches for about 6 miles. Now, that sounds like a lot, but when you consider the number of capital ships involved, if you convert that into kilometres and divide through the resulting just over 9 kilometres with the 28-odd capital ships, you actually realise that even if you treat the capital ships as sort of point sources with no length of their own, the spacing is actually maybe 2/3 of the 500 metres mentioned in this destroyer account. And once you take into account that actually, yes, the battleships do exist in 3 dimensions and they have their own length, the spacing between the Grand Fleet's capital ships is actually even less than that. And battle line generally for ships at sea would be fairly close order. It was effectively the minimum distance would be defined by assuming the enemy salvo is on target with a normal scatter of shot. Let's make sure we're not within that scatter of shot and basically give them free hits even if they've missed their intended target, plus a little bit of space for manoeuvring room. And that's about it, because the more concentrated your fleet is, the more preponderance of firepower you can bring to bear and the easier it is to relay orders. But in other circumstances, like say if you're heavily outnumbered, there may be advantages and disadvantages to closing up or widening the formation. If you widen things out, you force your enemy to split fire more, but at the same time, if you tighten things up and you're vastly outnumbered, you could end up with the enemy obscuring their own guns, which was kind of something of a problem with a number of situations where one force vastly outnumbered the other, and the sheer number of shell splashes made it very difficult to work out who exactly was on target and who needed to adjust their gunnery. Carriers, though, in terms of line ahead, they virtually never did it, but when they did, they tended to keep a bit more of a distance if they were doing flight operations because, well, aircraft launching, they needed some space to do so. Although, again, in some circumstances, like say the Battle of Cape Matapan, there were carriers forming a line ahead formation in battle with battleships, although they had to be persuaded to turn away from that particular encounter. So yeah, spacing, there's no such thing really as typical spacing. There might be suggested normal spacing for a particular type of ship in a particular navy as suggested by the standing orders, but that's going to vary from navy to navy, from ship class to ship class, and in any particular given tactical situation it's probably going to be altered anyway. Cicero asks, the Naval Act of 1794 approved the then eye-popping sum of $688,888.82 to construct, outfit and crew the original 6 frigates of the United States Navy. Apparently, halfway through the construction of these vessels, construction was stopped due to an exhaustion of funds blamed on reasons that seem awfully familiar: over-documentation, unreasonable materials requests, and the scattering of the frigate's construction to yards across the East Coast to provide economic stimulus. Compared to the costs of a similar British fourth rate, however, was the original allotment of funds reasonable for what Congress wanted? Moreover, was the Third Congress really making unreasonable requests for things like Southern Live Oak and the construction of each ship at a different yard? So actually, Congress's original budget wasn't too far off. To be honest, even in the best of circumstances, it probably still was a little bit underfunded. Now, the reason for this, we'll have a quick look. HMS Leopard, 50-gun fourth rate. Okay, marginally bigger than the US ships, and ironically enough also later to be involved in a bit of a standoff with said US ships. But when she was built a couple of years earlier, in 1790, she was built for just under £24,500, and then had to be fitted out at a further cost of just under £3,500. So overall, you're probably talking about £28,000, just under that, for the total expense involved in construction and fitting out of the Leopard, whose armament, broadly speaking, main gun deck 24-pounder guns, upper gun deck of lighter weapons, etc., is broadly similar to what the US Navy was trying to achieve with its frigates, albeit the Leopard stays fractionally larger. However, whilst that is the building and fitting out costs, it does not include the costs to crew the ship for its first voyage, which the US estimate does. Now, let's look at the US estimate with this almost $700,000 figure. Well, you've got to divide it through by 6 first, because there's 6 frigates being built. You then have to divide it through by 4.75, because that's the pound to dollar exchange rate. $4.75 buys you £1 in 1794. And that arrives at an equivalent value allocated per frigate of £24,171 and 50p. Well, actually, technically speaking, 6 shillings and a couple of pence, but whatever. Now, this immediately, as you can see, is about £3,500–4,000 less than the cost for Leopard. Leopard is a slightly larger vessel, say, but it's not that much larger. And this figure is supposed to also pay for the crew. So, yeah, no. Congress has underestimated there by a fair margin. You would probably need to have, I would say, if you're going to crew the ship as well, you probably need to allocate about the equivalent of about 30,000, maybe slightly over £30,000 for each ship. And when you translate that back, so multiply 30,000 by 4.75 to convert to dollars, and then multiply it by 6 because you have 6 frigates, that comes up to $855,000, which is quite a bit more. It's like almost $1 2/3 million more dollars than Congress had actually budgeted for. So yeah, Congress's budget was probably going to run out anyway, but it's within a shouting distance of an accurate estimate, at least, as compared to just how much money they actually ended up spending on finishing the ships. So I don't think asking for Southern Live Oak was an unreasonable request. Yes, it was going to push the cost of the ships up slightly, and they probably should have taken that into account, but well, we can see the combat results of that and the durability of the ships. It, as a sort of cost benefit, it definitely was worth it. The construction of the ships, each at very different yards in order to provide economic stimulus, this is a constant problem in many navies, but the US Navy especially, for a lot of time, where you're trying to effectively bribe individual state senators to vote for something, and congressmen to vote for something by promising that some of that money will come back to their particular area. Now, fair enough. The UK kind of does that at the moment, in as much as the UK, up until relatively recently, had shipbuilding capability of one sort or another up and down the UK, on the south coast in Portsmouth, in places like Belfast and Newcastle, as well as Scotland. And it has been a fairly calculated political decision to consolidate most of the heavy British warship construction industry in the past few years in Scotland, because it allows the government to say, look, well, if Scotland leaves the UK, I know this is verging into modern politics, but it has a direct bearing on this. It kind of allows the government to say, well, yeah, if you'd lose all that money and all that work. Now, when it comes to this scenario with the American ships in the various shipyards, it's a similar kind of thing of, well, if you vote against this bill, then all of this money that we were honestly planning to spend in your particular shipyard won't happen. Except that because you need more than 1 or 2 votes, you end up having to spread these things out all across the place, and that makes for inefficiencies, because you now have 6 sets of effectively project management, 6 sets of supply lines, 6 sets of everything. Whereas if you were to say, right, well, this shipyard or these couple of shipyards are the best at building it, so we're going to give most or all the contract to them, you have much fewer sets of management, much fewer sets of duplication of work, much fewer sets of lines of supply, and thus overall costs come down. But it is very much a political decision, as opposed to a direct engineering or naval decision, And so in a lot of ways, Congress pretty much shot themselves in the foot in that particular scenario. If they wanted the ships cheaply, then they should have identified one or two good builders and said, right, you get to do this wholesale. They tried to play both ends against the middle and ended up having to spend an absolute fortune in addition, which, if they'd been honest with themselves from the start, they probably would have had to earmark anyway, because these kind of things are not exactly unforeseen. John Rees asks, do you happen to know the reasoning behind several factions modifying their medium or heavy bombers to carry torpedoes during World War II? So it depends on the faction in question, or the side in question, if you like. The motivations varied quite considerably, but generally speaking, a medium or heavy bomber has a lot more range than the average single-engine torpedo bomber, which is a big advantage, especially if you're trying to raid enemy shipping from a long way away. So if you're trying to, say, conduct torpedo strikes against German shipping from the UK in occupied Europe, or if you are the Japanese and you're planning on a Pacific campaign, or you're the Americans and you're planning on stopping the Japanese from their Pacific campaign, and so on. So range is definitely a factor. Additionally, as you can see here with the Heinkel 111 torpedo bomber conversion, the larger aircraft can usually carry more than one torpedo, which means that for a given aircraft making a given attack run, then you have a higher chance of damaging a ship. There's also the fact that along with range comes better navigational capabilities, because obviously a large bomber, you have more crew, you can have someone dedicated to doing quite a lot of navigation as well as more self-defense, whereas in a single-engined bomber like an Avenger or a Swordfish, whilst you might have a navigator occasionally, they're going to have a lot harder of a job navigating from a relatively small and possibly open position as opposed to a navigator in the relatively spacious confines of a medium to heavy bomber. And when you're out at sea, navigation is pretty important. There's also what other aircraft do you have? Now, in a number of cases, there were perfectly serviceable single-engine torpedo bombers, and this was a supplemental force to do certain specific mission types. However, in other cases, such as especially with the Luftwaffe, they didn't really have that many single-engine torpedo bombers. So, and they didn't really have many single-engine aircraft capable of being converted to useful torpedo bombers either. There were a few that existed, but it was a lot easier to retain a margin of performance by just sticking torpedoes under, in this case, a medium bomber like a Heinkel 111, than it was to try and persuade something like, say, a Stuka to carry a heavy torpedo. It could do so, but Stukas were vulnerable enough as it was, let alone trying to get them to do low and slow torpedo runs. And even with the sheer numbers of aircraft produced in World War II, there was also a certain margin when it came to heavy and medium bombers of multiple uses. Now, obviously, something like a Swordfish or an Avenger could be used as a bomber as well, but their bomb-carrying capacities were somewhat more limited as compared to their torpedo-carrying capacity. Whereas with a heavy or medium bomber, Heinkel 111, Wellington, G3M, G4M, A26, etc., you could afford to put the relevant mountings for torpedoes, etc., and as you said, possibly carry more than one, without overly compromising that aircraft's ability to land, re-equip with bombs, and go out and drop a very heavy, useful bomb load. So you could get a lot of dual or multi-purpose roles out of the same aircraft, assuming, of course, that you could train the crews to manage those roles effectively. So, yeah, there were a number of advantages to doing so, and pretty much every major nation actually did so in some way, shape or form, although exactly what balance of those various factors they were taking into account as their primary driving force varied from nation to nation. William H. Burke III asks, it seems like in both world wars, Allied-Entente intelligence, military deception and comms decryption were more effective than what the Axis-Central Powers achieved. In the naval sphere, why was it that this was so one-sided? Alternatively, was it less one-sided than it seems in retrospect? In some respects, it came down to a matter of luck. In, for example, the Room 40 video, there was a certain degree of luck in the Royal Navy recovering, or other people recovering and then giving to the Royal Navy, practically every code book that the Germans actually used. That was certainly a huge stroke of luck and contributed greatly to their superior signals intelligence. Then, when you get to World War II, things like Enigma, you have the luck of having some incredibly intelligent Polish and other European signals code breakers and cryptanalysts who are all ending up in the UK at some point, fairly early in the war. Now, whether or not the British would have made anything close to the kind of advances against Enigma they would have done without them is very, very much open to doubt. But in that case, sort of the Germans' own success had worked against them somewhat because they took over all these countries. It meant that the combined cryptanalysis resources of pretty much the whole of Europe that wasn't Germany was ranged against Germany, all in one location. So, yeah, that helped. Matters of luck certainly play a part, but also it's not always quite so one-sided. The German naval encryptions in especially World War II were pretty much the hardest to break and to keep broken. Compared to that, the Army and the Luftwaffe codes and other general codes were a lot easier to break and would stay broken for a lot longer. The Kriegsmarine was actually much better at signals security and adaptation than the other branches of the armed forces, although again it still was broken with a relative degree of regularity. Then you also have to take into account that whilst a lot of the decisions and encounters that were made on the basis of that cryptanalysis led to some rather decisive battles and such like, which in turn obviously amplifies the supposedly one-sidedness of the situation, it wasn't entirely one-sided. Now, fair enough, the Germans didn't have the world's greatest success breaking Royal Navy codes, although they occasionally would. The Italians actually had a much greater level of success at breaking Royal Navy codes. Now, whilst it never approached the same level of success that the Allies were having in reverse against the Germans, it did mean that at various points Admiralty signals were compromised, and there were a number of instances where Royal Navy ships either suffered or had to abort missions because of counter moves made on the basis of that intelligence. It's just you don't hear so much about it because in the end Germany and Italy lost. So sort of in the common mind, obviously they can't have been quite as good, and people therefore don't do so much digging, but also because they genuinely didn't have the same kind of breaks of luck and strokes of genius that the Allied Entente signals had. So although they did manage to crack various Allied codes, they weren't able to do so as consistently or for as long in any given situation as the Allies were. Federico Bozzi asks, what was the maximum thickness of armour that could be produced? If I remember, you said the Japanese had some trouble producing Yamato's main plates because it was difficult to cool them properly due to their thickness. Yamato's main plates were pushing it for the Japanese, but still just about within their capabilities, although they were having some issues. The bigger challenge actually was the face plates for the main battery turrets, which were considerably thicker and did have a whole host of issues, because 22 plus inches of armour, it was beyond the reliable ability of technology at the time to pull that off. You could, with a bit of luck, but the quality was not going to be 100% as much as you'd want it to be. Now, as far as the maximum thickness of armour that could be produced, it varied obviously over time. You look at, say, the 1860s American Civil War. At that point, thanks to technological advancement, the Royal Navy and the Marine Nationale were able to produce 4.5-inch plate, single solid plate. The Americans weren't. They had to go with laminated layers of thinner plate. But technology advanced, the Americans caught up. By the mid to late 1860s, they were able to produce solid 4.5-inch plate, albeit maybe the quality wouldn't be quite as good, but they could do it, whereas before they couldn't. And this kind of rolls on as armour is produced in thicker and thicker quantities. The ability to do so, the industry to do so, obviously goes up. Once you get into the face hardening process, that's a completely different story as opposed to just solid lumps of iron. And so the ability to produce armour scales as it goes through World War I, interwar period World War II. You always have to remember that actually turret faces in a lot of ships actually tend to be the thickest parts, so the main belt is not usually too difficult to produce. It's more about the size of it rather than the actual thickness. So, yeah, you can probably reliably produce, by sort of the World War II period, an 18 to 20 inch thick slab of armour if you're doing it for a turret face, and that theoretically chains into being able to produce a similar thickness of armour for the belt of your ship if necessary. However, due to square cube law, the sheer volume of metal goes up quite considerably as you add thickness. And so, yeah, without a significant advance in the technology, particularly around the cooling and heating of steel, you're probably looking at somewhere around 20 inches, maybe just a fraction over 20 inches of armour as being the most realistic that you can produce with late 30s, early 1940s technology reliably when you're coming to produce face-hardened armour. As I say, obviously the Japanese did make some innovations in producing slightly thicker plate with some varying degrees of success, but it was really pushing the envelope, and if everyone had wanted to go in that direction, there would have had to have been some form of change and advancement in the procedures and processes involved in order to accomplish that. Aaron Davis asks, with history there will always be questions that cannot be answered. What battle or incident would you most like to have all the answers to, and why? I think it's really a tie for me. One would be the Battle of the Yalu River. I know we've covered that a couple of times in this Drydock, but seriously, I've been trying to put a script together for this battle for a video for months now, and I've got 3 books specifically on the Battle of Yalu River, that at least 2 of which claim to be the definitive account, plus a bunch of other references from other works that sort of cover it in passing. Can you get a single bit one of them to agree on the major timeline of things in any way, shape or form? No. About the most consistent parts that you can get are the after-action damage reports from the Japanese fleet, but that still doesn't necessarily tell you when the damage was inflicted or by who, and even then, some of the quote-unquote definitive accounts talk about damage that the Japanese damage reports don't actually show happening. Meanwhile, the Japanese damage reports do show some fairly major damage that some of the so-called definitive accounts don't mention at all. So, it should have been a lot better documented, considering that it's a relatively speaking recent battle. So yeah, I'd really like the answers to that particular encounter. The other incident I think I'd personally like answers to would be what happened to the HMS Victory that immediately preceded the one we've got now. Because, well, to be honest, pretty much all we know is she went down in a storm. For ages, where everyone thought she'd gone down was actually completely wrong. Turns out she'd gone down somewhere else. But why she'd gone down there, what the circumstances were that led up to that, etc., well, when things go down with all hands, it's pretty difficult to work out. So yeah, I'd like to know exactly what it was, like how bad was that storm and what circumstances led a whole first-rate ship of the line to founder in the English Channel. Brad asks, what were the plans for using the treaty ports in Ireland before they were handed back? Using them as naval bases seems pretty conservative. Would merchant ships be unloaded there? So no, merchant ships wouldn't be unloaded there, because at the end of the day, those ports were still within the, at the time, Irish Free State, later Ireland, and so if that nation, whatever name it's happened to be going under at any particular time, was neutral, then you would be fairly hard-pressed for it to argue it was maintaining its neutrality if it allowed supplies to Britain to be transported through it, and they would have to be, because well, Ireland isn't physically connected to the UK, which, apart from Northern Ireland, which means that you could maybe unload supplies for Northern Ireland, but if you're going to unload supplies for Northern Ireland, you might as well send them straight to Belfast. And other than that, all you'd be doing would be compromising the neutrality of Ireland by transporting goods through them to Northern Ireland, where you'd have to re-embark them on ships and send them across to the mainland UK anyway. So not really much point in unloading merchant shipping at the treaty ports. Basically, the treaty ports existed for a twofold purpose, both purposes being military and very strategic in nature. One of which was that, well, if you're trying to guard the Atlantic, whether it be from submarines or surface raiders, these ports are closer to the Atlantic than ports on the mainland of the UK, so it's better to base your ships from there because you can react faster and be out at sea longer. And secondly, because with Ireland in the hands of a foreign government, it means that the UK can't base full defence forces there, and it's very, very bad for UK security if somebody were to overrun the relatively lightly defended Irish Free State or Ireland in order to gain a foothold. Obviously, then they can directly threaten Northern Ireland, and they're very close to the mainland UK as well, and able to cut off British shipping very easily coming into and out of the Atlantic. And so it's in British interests to defend Ireland, even if Ireland's navy itself isn't up to all that much. And that's the other main purpose of the treaty ports, is basically to make sure no one else can come in and cause trouble for Ireland in order to maintain the safety and security of the UK. Julian Arnott asks, how are the masts of Age of Sail ships held down? Is it just by weight, or is there some other way? And how easy is it to change masts out at sea? Masts and spars are partly held in place by their own weight, but there's also a vast amount of rigging. This doesn't necessarily hold the things down, but it does hold them in place, because there will be a fair bit of sway, and so you can see in this example of HMS Victory in Slightly Happier Times, the masts of rigging, well, the rigging and such like, and ropes are designed mainly to stabilise the masts, to prevent them from going backwards and forwards and left and right, etc. Too much. There is a certain amount of sway that's necessary to be allowed, and rope is flexible, but not too much, because otherwise they will snap, and that's a very bad thing. They're also held in within the ship itself by various clamps and bolts and such like as well. How the spars are attached? Well, again, mostly by tying and ropes, with some bolts and plates depending on the specific ship in question. And how easy is it to change them out at sea? Practically impossible, because, well, you can look at the amount of rigging that's involved, and also you need cranes and such like. It's not going to happen out at sea. You're not going to replace a full mast if you lose one. You can jury rig a much lighter, smaller mast if one happens to be lost in a storm or shot away, but that is, as I say, going to be a much smaller type of mast as compared to the full mast and spars that you have when everything is vaguely intact. So, yeah. There were occasionally ships with cranes that could come out and remast smaller ships like brigs and sloops and maybe a small frigate, but even then it would still be a slightly larger version of a jury rig solution, because the amount of block and tackle and roping you'd need to replace a mast that had been shot away or blown away, it's not something that a ship would carry at sea. Bill Luster asks, could you talk about the practical aspects of minelaying operations in World War I and World War II? Aside from submarine minelayers, it seems almost suicidal to sail into enemy waters in a small undergun ship full of explosives. So yes, minelaying is a rather hazardous activity, because the enemy definitely doesn't want you to do it, and yeah, you're full of very delicate explosives, so they can stop you from doing it in a rather decisive fashion. But this is why in World War II a lot of minelaying was done by aircraft, well, not only because they're faster and theoretically can penetrate deeper into enemy defences before dropping their mines, but simply because, well, they're a lot harder to intercept, even if they carry individually fewer mines. Now, there were still minelayers, the Aberdeen class is pictured here, in both World War I and World War II, but it generally came under two primary guises when you're not talking about submarines, one of which was covert minelaying. So this would be done by, especially with the Germans, by merchant raiders or armed merchant cruisers, when they'd head out, they'd carry a lot of mines, and because they were merchant ships, and usually merchant ships disguised as other merchant ships, they would take that opportunity to lay mines in areas where a warship would be obviously much more easily spotted and dealt with. So there's that, and to a certain degree the British and Americans and such would also do similar practices, but it was a lot harder to do because a merchant ship off, say, the northwest coast of Scotland is a relatively expected sight. A random fishing trawler just off the coast of Heligoland Bight, not so much. Now, the other type of Minelaying, kind of like the Abdiel class or the Manxman class, are very, very fast. And they would run in under the cover of night and drop off their mines and then turn around and try and get away as fast as possible. Or sometimes they'd come in at high speed during the day, lay their mines overnight, and then try and get away under the cover of night as fast as possible. And their high speed was key to this because they could transition into the area a lot faster. So if you timed it right, especially given the limited range of most aircraft at the time, you would ideally trying to approach the boundary of enemy aircraft patrol areas around about the evening. You'd then run in under what would ostensibly be their air coverage area during the hours of darkness. You would lay your mines around about midnight, early morning, and then you run as fast as you possibly can back the other way, so that hopefully by the time dawn light appears and you might be vulnerable to air attack, you'll be right at the marginal edge of their air cover, which means that even if you are attacked, it'll probably be by an aircraft that happens to be in the area, because by the time he's summoned friends, you will, with any luck, be beyond the range of retribution. Sui420 Den asks, how does the Borodino class battlecruiser compare to her contemporaries if the Russians were able to complete them? So assuming that they'd been able to complete them around about the time they actually wanted to do so, which would have been 1915, 1916-ish, they would have presented quite the interesting conundrum for the other navies of the world. Their speed wouldn't have been fantastic compared to ships like Tiger, Lutzow, etc., the battle cruisers that were launching in and around that time, or actually, to be honest, coming into service in and around that time. I suppose you could look at Hindenburg and Renown. It's a bit slow. 26 to 27 knots. That's kind of the speed you expect to see from the very first battle cruisers. Maybe the second set built. Armour-wise, after some revisions, was okay. It's just a fraction over 9 inches maximum belt thickness, so comparable to Lion, Princess Royal, Queen Mary, and Tiger. Less armoured than the German battle cruisers, obviously, but as shown at Jutland, for that 1915-1916 period against 11 and 12-inch shell fire, as long as it doesn't get too close, it's probably alright. Now, armament is very, very nice. I mean, okay, it's got this kind of flat iron, almost Gangot-style turret layout, which isn't necessarily the best for arcs of fire, but 12 14-inch guns in a period when Tiger's mounting 8 13.5s, Derflinger and Lutzow are doing 8 12s. The Congos, fair enough, they have 14-inch, but they've only got 8 of them, and this has 12. So the Borodinos would have had a lot of firepower for battle cruisers, but it's kind of that trade-off of, in this particular case, they're trading off firepower against speed. And so, yeah, it would have been an interesting scenario. Comparing to their contemporaries, it would, I think, have depended on the numbers available on each side, because obviously they were planning on building 4. If the Borodinos were up against roughly equal numbers, or maybe one greater, so 5 versus 4, then they've got pretty decent odds, I think, because of that massive preponderance of firepower. They've got half again more firepower than anyone else, so that's always good. The speed means, well, they can't dictate the engagement, but there are issues with the 14-inch gun the Russians were planning to use, but we can assume that they would have resolved them at least somewhat. To say, the speed's not fantastic, but you're not really going to want to close in against that kind of massive firepower, and staying at range, their armour should be relatively decent. Now, where they might be at a disadvantage is if they end up fighting substantially more than 5 to 4 odds. So if, say, Jutland doesn't happen and Hindenburg gets commissioned, and you end up with sort of a 6 versus 4, or potentially worse, of first scouting group versus the Borodinos, then the fact that they can't escape means they're in trouble. And likewise, if they end up fighting the battlecruiser fleet in a circumstance that doesn't really involve BT, so either 1st, 2nd and 3rd battlecruiser squadrons, or 1st and 2nd with 5th Battle Squadron in close attendance, the numerical advantage of not just guns, but also in terms of the fact that various ships can engage the Borodinos whilst they themselves are unengaged, means that they would probably have to withdraw, but they don't have the speed to withdraw, at which point they're in trouble. So yeah, they would have made a very interesting and worthy addition to the annals of the battlecruisers, assuming that no massively unexpected issues cropped up. Assuming they were completed in time, obviously. Jacques asks, what is your favourite naval title? It's got to be, hands down and without a doubt, Lord High Admiral. There is no better naval title. Jellybean asks, in your video, The Architecture of Dreadnoughts Blueprints of Success, you discussed the bulbous bow. What speeds were bulbous bows on warships designed for? Was it their maximum speed to get an extra knot or two, their cruising speed to save fuel and extend range, to look good? I ask because previous reference to metrocentric height led me to another channel of Nick the Naval Architect. He posted some videos on bulbous bows, including one on their limitations, where he says bulbous bows only work well at or about a specific speed. Warship designers must have thought bulbous bows were worthwhile, but I haven't heard what they were hoping to achieve. So bulbous bows on warships were designed mainly around the maximum speed in order to, well, as you say, gain an extra knot or two compared to what they would have been able to achieve otherwise, or to achieve a similar speed and with a reduction in overall engine power that was required. So the reason for that is, as you say, bulbous bows, they, above a certain speed, above about 12-15 knots, they do work to a degree, but the effect of their work is massively reduced compared to at their optimal speed. And so really, while you might see a few savings here and there by having a bulbous bow at other speeds, in some areas that'll be offset by the additional weight that and drag you've imposed by having it in the first place. In other cases, you see a marginal saving, but it's not really worth writing home about. It's only in that zone where it's specifically configured for that you will actually get the big savings. And so because running at full speed is the thing that burns the most fuel, and the drag, etc., is the biggest limitation on top speed for a given power plant, the bulbous bows generally were configured for around about the top speed that they were hoping to achieve for that particular warship. And when you look at the various power plant requirements for battleships that were capable of going 26, 27, 28 knots compared to the engine requirements for battleships of roughly similar displacements that were going up to sort of 30 plus knots, you can see the massive increase in power requirement, therefore the massive increase in engine space and machinery space that was needed, and the bulbous bow helps cut down on that quite considerably. And so that is where the most savings are going to be, because if you've got a bulbous bow that's configured to work well at cruising speed, well then you'll save a little bit of cruising fuel, which will extend your range if you keep the tanks about the same size, but your machinery you'll probably actually end up needing slightly more, because the bulbous bow might act against you when you're running at top speed, and thus either your top speed is going to be lower or you're going to actually end up needing more machinery. Whereas if you do it the other way around, the bulbous bow helping the most at the top end speed, well, your cruising speed you're most efficient anyway, so a very slight reduction there isn't the end of the world. But if you're able to run with 20-25% or more less horsepower at a given target top speed than a contemporary battleship that doesn't have a bulbous bow, well, that's a whole lot of extra machinery you don't need, which means that space can be devoted to other things, whether that be firepower protection, etc., etc., in terms of displacement, or reducing the overall size and thus cost of the ship in terms of hull volume, or using that hull volume for completely different purposes. Jake Hart asks a very similar question. He said, you mentioned ram bows had a partial effect of cancelling the bow wave, but I would have guessed certain rams create a wave that interferes constructively with the bow wave, thus making the total wave larger. Are there any noted instances of this occurring, or was it simply too unlikely in practice? In theory, it's possible. However, the speed regimens at which a bulbous bow or bulbous bow-like structure creates constructive interference, that's where the two waves start to overlap and thus become even worse in terms of rising higher for the ship. That's a very, very niche area, and to be honest, mathematically it normally would happen at far too low a speed for it to actually matter, because the amount of bow wave at that point is going to be so tiny that whether it's 4 inches or 8 inches isn't going to actually matter to a large ship. There's also the fact that whilst ram bows did have something of an effect, that, as you can see from HMS Polyphemus here, they're nowhere near as large as bulbous bows, and so their effect on the sea is nowhere near as large. This is why they had an effect, but not the same effect, because they're just not displacing as much water. So even if by sheer happenstance and luck the bow wave created by a ram bow happened to work exactly in the best way possible at the exact target top speed of the battleship in question, because it's much smaller, it's not going to displace as much water, which means it might reduce the bow wave on the actual ship itself slightly, but not by anywhere near as much as an actual dedicated bulbous bow design. Lewis Maskell asks, in Warrior to Dreadnought by D.K. Brown on Chapter 12, under the section Seakeeping, he writes, there seems to have been an almost masochistic view that life at sea should be unpleasant, in commentating about the Victorian obsession with lower freeboards as compared to those who came after them. In your opinion, is this just a rather nice piece of hyperbole, or does it hit on some element of Victorian design in this era? There is a reasonable bit of truth to that. You can see here HMS Trafalgar with its wonderfully low freeboard. I think this is probably the only sea state in which it's not going to be taking water over the bow. Now, yeah, so there's a certain amount of truth to it. The reason that freeboards were so low was because of the weight of the fully armoured cylindrical turrets and the massive amounts of iron and later compound armour that they were having to install to keep the citadel safe. Just meant that, well, one, those heavy turrets, if they were mounted much higher, would cause stability problems on ships of this kind of size. And secondly, if you're going to install 2 foot of solid metal armour, it can't be very tall, otherwise again it's just going to drag you down. So by lowering the freeboards, it meant that you didn't have to protect as much of the hull area, which meant your overall armour volume was less, which made you stay afloat, and your gun turrets also came down a level, which meant that they caused less stability issues. And you see this actually in the Majestic class, when most of them are built with fully armoured barbettes, but HMS Hood, the predecessor by name to the famous battlecruiser, was built pretty much to exactly the same design, but with the traditional circular fully armoured turrets, and just to keep that thing stable they had to drop everything by a deck. And so it looked a lot more like this than it did the rest of its Majestic half-sisters. So, yeah, there's reasons for it, but at the same time, the Victorians did know how to improve seakeeping aboard ships with low freeboard. The breastwork monitors are a perfect example of this, with their little pop-up panels to improve seakeeping, and there's no particular reason why that couldn't have been put in place on battleships of this kind as well. But, I mean, yes, it would have cost slightly more, but not a tremendous amount. But yeah, there was a certain element of, well, yeah, we could do this thing, but it'll cost slightly fractionally more, and there may be a tiny, tiny, tiny amount of additional shrapnel generated in battle. And the main benefits, to be perfectly honest, are to the crew, and, well, the crew should be tough and hard men, so they're clearly not going to need it all that much, so we could eliminate it. Of course, there were other opinions within the Victorian Admiralty that tended more towards the practical side of maybe being able to fight in a sea state that didn't involve mill ponds, but The Victorian British Navy was large enough and had a diverse enough range of thought that if you laser in on any particular admiral or group of admirals, you can usually find an argument to support both sides of a particular controversy and everything in between. And there usually be some admiral going off on his own idea about how the aliens from Mars have directed that he invent a death ray that can be projected from the captain's eyes or something like that. It was a rather interesting time. And lastly, for this section, Gabriel A. Hawkins asks, I was watching the launch of HMS Prince of Wales as it was making its way into the fog, and there was a man standing on the bow of the ship dressed in circa 1700 clothing, probably a kilt, appearing to hold a staff or something similar. It also appeared as though he was somehow watching over the ship. I have since tried to find videos of this without success, as it seemed pretty cool. So, do you know anything about the video I saw? Is this some kind of Royal Navy tradition? It's not a launch tradition that I'm aware of immediately offhand. Given the context that Prince of Wales was launched in Scotland, the appearance of somebody in a kilt in some form of ceremonial position wouldn't come as a massive surprise to me, but it would be a case of, well, I guess that would seem appropriate for the area. As I say, I'm not entirely sure of any particular launching tradition surrounding the Royal Navy in general, or ships named Prince of Wales in particular that calls for this, and I also tried to look it up to see if I could work out what was going on, but likewise had no luck. So, yeah, unfortunately I don't know, but if anyone out there was either present during the launching of Prince of Wales or happens to know anything about said possible tradition, please let us know in the comments below, and then, well, there'll be at least 2 people whose curiosity has been satiated. And that brings us to the end of this month's Patreon Drydock, at least the pre-recorded section. Of course, there will be the Patreon Drydock live stream, which will have taken place at the point that you're listening to this, either the day before or 2 days earlier, and so that will form the other part of this Q&A, where all of the sort of alt history, etc. questions from the Patreon questions for this month have been answered separately. So thanks very much for listening, and hope to see you again in another video soon. Apologies again for the slight delay in announcing winners for the giveaway, but well, as you understand, there has been a few complications of late. I hope to have the announcement of winners. I'll put it up as a community post during the week once I've narrowed down all the names, and next Drydock definitely I will also announce it there. So again, thanks very much, and see you again in another video.